From a limping boy pharaoh wandering torchlit halls to a lonely moonlit king on an alpine tower, this is a calm yet haunting journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with why Egypt once crowned a sickly child born of siblings, and move deeper into how tangled bloodlines stirred midnight madness beneath a British crown. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Tutankhamun, boy pharaoh born of siblings. The year is 1323 BCE, and somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, a young man barely past his 18th birthday draws his final breath. His name is Tutankhamun, and he has no idea that 3,000 years later, his mummy will become the most famous corpse in human history. What he also doesn't know is that his death will spark one of archaeology's greatest detective stories, one that leads not to treasure or ancient curses, but to a far more uncomfortable truth about the price of keeping power in the family. For most of us, the story of King Tut begins and ends with Howard Carter's famous discovery in 1922, the golden mask, the pristine tomb, the supposed curse that followed. But the real story of Tutankhamun begins much earlier, in the tangled branches of a family tree that had been pruning itself for generations. To understand the boy king, we first need to understand the family that created him, and that means diving into the deliberately confusing world of the Amarna period. The Amarna family tree reads like a genealogist's fever dream. At its center sits Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who moved Egypt's capital and revolutionized its religion. Traditional Egyptian records, never ones to air royal dirty laundry, become frustratingly vague when it comes to family relationships during this period. But modern science has ways of making the dead talk, and what the mummies have to say is fascinating. DNA analysis of the royal mummies found in tomb KV62 has revealed something that ancient Egyptian scribes would have been too polite to mention outright. Tutankhamun's parents were siblings. Not half-siblings, not cousins, but full brother and sister. The genetic evidence is unambiguous, showing that whoever gave birth to the boy, King shared both parents with his father. This wasn't necessarily shocking by Egyptian royal standards. The pharaohs had been marrying their sisters for over 1,000 years by Tutankhamun's time, following the example of the gods themselves. Isis had married her brother Osiris, after all, and what was good enough for the gods was certainly good enough for their earthly representatives. But there's a difference between the occasional sibling marriage and the systematic inbreeding that had become standard practice by the 18th dynasty. The physical evidence tells a story that palace scribes never recorded. CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy reveal a litany of birth defects and developmental abnormalities that read like a medical textbook's chapter on the dangers of consanguinity. His skull shows signs of temporal lobe epilepsy. His spine curves in an abnormal shape. His left foot is clubbed, requiring him to walk with a cane, dozens of which were found in his tomb. His chest is sunken, his ribs malformed. Most tellingly, his skull shows evidence of craniosynostosis, a condition where the bones of the skull fuse prematurely. This creates the elongated, almost alien-looking head shape that appears in so much Amarna period art. For decades, art historians debated whether this distinctive look was artistic style or anatomical reality. The mummies have settled the debate conclusively. It was both. But perhaps the most revealing detail isn't what the DNA tests found, but what they didn't find. Despite being married to his half-sister Ankhesenamun for several years, Tutankhamun left no surviving children. 2 mummified fetuses were found in his tomb, both female, both showing signs of severe genetic abnormalities. One had died in the 2nd trimester, the other shortly after birth. The royal bloodline, already strained to the breaking point, couldn't sustain itself another generation. Daily life in Tutankhamun's court was a careful dance around the young pharaoh's limitations. Palace records, preserved on thousands of ostraca and papyri, paint a picture of a king who ruled more in name than in fact. Real power lay with his advisors, particularly the Vizier I and the General Horemheb, both of whom had served under Akhenaten and understood the delicate political situation. The boy king's day began before dawn, not with the vigorous physical activities expected of a pharaoh, but with careful preparation by palace physicians. His clubbed foot required special attention, his walking sticks arranged within easy reach. Court ceremonies were choreographed to minimize his physical limitations, with the throne positioned to hide his deformities and scribes trained to record his words when speech became difficult. Egypt during Tutankhamun's reign was an empire in decline, though not entirely due to his personal limitations. The Amarna period had destabilized traditional religious and administrative structures. Provincial governors had grown too independent, foreign territories were slipping away, and the economy was strained by years of religious upheaval. The young pharaoh's court was less concerned with grand conquests than with simple survival. International correspondence from this period, preserved in the Amarna archives, reveals a kingdom struggling to maintain its status. Letters from vassal kings in Syria and Palestine grow increasingly desperate, pleading for military support that never comes. Egypt's allies watch nervously as the Hittite Empire expands southward, filling the power vacuum left by Egyptian weakness. In the palace workshops, artisans worked feverishly to maintain the illusion of royal power. Tutankhamun's famous golden mask wasn't originally made for him at all, but was hastily adapted from a mask intended for someone else, probably a female member of the royal family. The slight feminine features visible beneath the royal regalia tell their own story about the scramble to provide appropriate burial goods for a pharaoh who died far too young. The irony of Tutankhamun's legacy is that his tomb's most important revelation had nothing to do with treasure. Howard Carter's discovery was remarkable not for what it contained, but for what it represented: the end of a genetic experiment that had been running for over 3 centuries. The boy king wasn't just the last pharaoh of his immediate family line. He was the living embodiment of what happens when royal bloodlines become too refined for their own good. His mummy tells a story that no amount of gold could disguise. Here was a young man whose body bore the accumulated genetic burden of generations of strategic marriages, whose physical form had been shaped by the political necessity of keeping power within an ever-shrinking family circle. The walking sticks found in his tomb weren't symbols of authority, they were medical necessities. The silence of Tutankhamun's tomb, sealed for over 3 millennia, ultimately spoke louder than any royal proclamation. When Howard Carter's team finally opened those nested coffins, they found not just a perfectly preserved pharaoh, but a genetic cautionary tale written in bone and tissue. The boy king's legacy isn't really about curses or treasure. It's about the price of isolation, the cost of keeping bloodlines pure, and the biological reality that even gods must follow the laws of genetics. In the end, Tutankhamun's greatest contribution to history might be the lesson his mummy teaches about the dangers of genetic isolation. His tomb, pristine and untouched, preserved not just the artifacts of kingship, but the physical evidence of what happens when royal families become too royal for their own good. The boy pharaoh, born of siblings and dead before his 20th birthday, stands as perhaps history's most famous example of the principle that power, like genetics, is best when it's shared. Akhenaten, the heretic's hidden handicaps. Long before his son Tutankhamun became a household name, there was Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried to revolutionize Egypt and nearly destroyed it in the process. History remembers him as the heretic king, the monotheist who challenged 3,000 years of religious tradition. But the more we learn about Akhenaten's physical condition, the more we wonder whether his radical religious reforms were symptoms of something deeper than spiritual revelation. Akhenaten's story begins with a family tree that had been closing in on itself for generations. The 18th dynasty had perfected the art of strategic inbreeding, marrying siblings and cousins with the methodical precision of a stock breeder selecting prize cattle. By the time of Akhenaten's birth, sometime around 1380 BCE, the royal bloodline had become so concentrated that genetic diversity was less a goal than an accident. The pharaoh's parentage tells us everything we need to know about the genetic lottery he was born into. His father, Amenhotep III, had married his own sister, Sitamun, while also taking the title queen for another sister, Henuteneb, but the real genetic complexity comes from his mother's side. Recent DNA analysis suggests that Akhenaten's mother was herself the product of a first-cousin marriage, meaning that her gene pool was already significantly restricted before she contributed to her son's genetic makeup. This double dose of first-cousin ancestry created what geneticists call a genetic bottleneck, where the same problematic alleles appear repeatedly in a family line. For Akhenaten, this manifested in ways that would have been immediately apparent to anyone who saw him in person, though court artists became skilled at presenting these abnormalities as divine attributes rather than medical conditions. The physical evidence from Akhenaten's reign tells a story that official records would never dare to record. Artistic depictions from his court show a man with dramatically elongated features, an impossibly long skull, spider-like fingers, feminine hips, and a protruding belly that suggests hormonal imbalances. For decades, art historians debated whether this distinctive Amarna style represented artistic innovation or anatomical accuracy. The discovery of royal mummies from this period has settled the debate decisively in favor of anatomical reality. Akhenaten's skull, when it was eventually identified among the royal mummies, shows clear signs of craniosynostosis, the same condition that affected his son Tutankhamun. But where Tutankhamun's case was relatively mild, Akhenaten's appears to have been severe. The premature fusion of skull bones created not just the elongated head shape visible in his portraits, but likely caused increased intracranial pressure, potentially leading to the headaches, vision problems, and neurological symptoms that may have influenced his behavior throughout his reign. The pharaoh's long, delicate fingers weren't just artistic stylization either. They suggest a connective tissue disorder, possibly Marfan syndrome, or a related condition. This would explain not just his unusual proportions, but also potential cardiovascular problems, joint instability, and the chronic pain that may have contributed to his increasingly erratic behavior as his reign progressed. Perhaps most significantly, Akhenaten's feminine body shape and apparent gynecomastia point to serious endocrine disruptions. Some historians have suggested he may have suffered from Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal condition that can cause exactly these kinds of physical changes. Others point to the possibility of an aromatase excess syndrome, where the body converts too much testosterone to estrogen. Either condition would have created not just physical abnormalities, but psychological and emotional instabilities that could explain his dramatic personality changes. The religious revolution that defines Akhenaten's reign takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his probable medical conditions. His decision to abandon the traditional Egyptian pantheon in favor of a single god, the Aten, wasn't just unprecedented. It was potentially catastrophic for a civilization that had based its entire identity on religious continuity. But what if this wasn't spiritual enlightenment, but rather a coping mechanism for a man struggling with chronic pain, neurological symptoms, and the psychological stress of ruling an empire while dealing with a body that was failing him? The timeline of Akhenaten's religious reforms correlates suspiciously with what we know about the progression of his physical condition. Early in his reign, the changes were relatively minor, elevating the Aten from one god among many to a position of special prominence. But as his physical symptoms likely worsened, his religious reforms became more radical and more divorced from Egyptian tradition. By the end of his reign, he had effectively declared himself the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine, a position that conveniently excused him from many of the physical demands of traditional pharaonic duties. The new capital city he built at Amarna tells its own story about a ruler adapting his environment to his limitations. Unlike traditional Egyptian temples with their dark, enclosed spaces and complex processional routes, Akhenaten's temples were open-air structures that could be navigated more easily by someone with mobility issues. The royal residence was designed with unusually wide doorways and gentle ramps rather than stairs, architectural features that make perfect sense for a pharaoh who may have used mobility aids. Court life at Amarna was carefully choreographed to accommodate the pharaoh's physical limitations while maintaining the illusion of divine authority. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate ceremonies where Akhenaten would appear on a balcony above the courtyard, showering gold and honors on his subjects below. This window of appearances became a signature feature of Amarna court life, but it also served a practical purpose. It allowed the pharaoh to maintain royal dignity while minimizing his physical movement. The artistic revolution that accompanied Akhenaten's religious reforms also takes on new significance when viewed through a medical lens. The hyper-realistic style that emerged during his reign, with its emphasis on physical imperfections and anatomical accuracy, may have been less about artistic innovation and more about necessity. When the pharaoh's physical abnormalities were so obvious that they couldn't be hidden, the solution was to reframe them as signs of divine favor rather than genetic misfortune. Royal family portraits from this period show not just Akhenaten, but his wife Nefertiti and their daughters sharing similar physical characteristics. This suggests that the genetic problems weren't limited to the pharaoh himself, but were spreading through the royal family as a whole. The famous bust of Nefertiti, with its impossibly long neck and angular features, may be less idealized beauty and more anatomical documentation. The succession crisis that followed Akhenaten's death makes perfect sense in the context of his genetic legacy. His designated heir, his son Tutankhamun, was clearly unfit for the physical demands of kingship. The brief reign of the mysterious pharaoh, Smenkhkare, who may have been either Akhenaten's brother or son, ended equally quickly. The royal family's genetic problems had reached a crisis point where producing viable heirs was becoming increasingly difficult. Foreign correspondence from the Amarna period reveals how Egypt's international standing suffered under Akhenaten's rule. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine complained that Egyptian military support was no longer reliable. Traditional allies began hedging their bets, making overtures to Egypt's enemies. The pharaoh, who had once been considered a living god, was increasingly seen as weak and unstable by both his subjects and his international peers. The economic disruption caused by Akhenaten's religious reforms was equally severe. The traditional temple system wasn't just religious, it was the backbone of Egypt's economy. When the pharaoh redirected resources from traditional temples to his new Aten cult, he didn't just offend the priests, he destabilized the entire economic system. Agricultural production declined, trade relationships suffered, and the skilled artisans who had built Egypt's reputation for luxury goods found themselves without work. But perhaps the most telling evidence of Akhenaten's condition comes from the medical equipment found in royal tombs from this period. Surgical instruments, medical papyri, and pharmaceutical preparations found in Amarna period burials suggest that the royal family required constant medical attention. The famous Edwin Smith papyrus, one of the earliest known medical texts, contains detailed descriptions of neurological conditions that match many of Akhenaten's probable symptoms. The ultimate irony of Akhenaten's reign is that his attempt to create a new, purer form of Egyptian religion may have been driven by the very genetic impurity that was destroying his family line. The pharaoh who preached about the perfection of the Aten was himself the product of generations of genetic compromise. His religious revolution, which he presented as divine revelation, may have been nothing more than the confused efforts of a sick man trying to make sense of a world that had become as distorted as his own reflection. When Akhenaten died, sometime around 1000, 336 BCE, his religious reforms died with him. His successor, Tutankhamun, immediately began the process of restoring traditional Egyptian religion. The new capital at Amarna was abandoned, its temples dismantled, and its records deliberately destroyed. But the genetic legacy of Akhenaten's reign couldn't be so easily erased. The physical problems that had shaped his reign would continue to plague his successors, eventually leading to the collapse of the 18th dynasty altogether. The heretic pharaoh's story serves as a cautionary tale about the hidden costs of genetic isolation. His radical religious reforms, his architectural innovations, and his artistic revolution may all have been symptoms of the same underlying problem, a royal bloodline that had become too refined for its own good. Akhenaten didn't just challenge Egyptian religious tradition, he embodied the biological reality that even gods must follow the laws of genetics. Ptolemy ibn Philopator, when brother love became law. In the sprawling metropolis of Alexandria, where Greek learning met Egyptian mysticism, and the world's greatest library housed humanity's accumulated knowledge, there lived a king whose personal life was about to become the blueprint for 3 centuries of systematic inbreeding. Ptolemy IV, Philopator, who ruled Egypt from 221 to 204 BCE, wasn't content with the usual royal practice of marrying cousins. Instead, he decided to marry his full sister, Arsinoe III, thereby establishing a precedent that would define the Ptolemaic dynasty and ultimately destroy it. The Ptolemaic family tree, if you can call it a tree, resembles something more like a telephone pole with a few stubborn branches. Starting with Ptolemy I, Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals who had carved out Egypt as his personal kingdom after Alexander's death, the dynasty had initially followed relatively conventional Greek practices when it came to marriage alliances. But by the time of Ptolemy IV, the family had decided that the best way to preserve their divine status was to keep their bloodline as pure as possible. Ptolemy IV's decision to marry his sister wasn't made in isolation. It was a calculated political move designed to strengthen his claim to the throne and eliminate potential rivals. In the complex world of Hellenistic politics, marriage alliances were weapons, and sibling marriage was the ultimate defensive strategy. By marrying Arsinoe III, Ptolemy IV ensured that any children they produced would have an unassailable claim to the throne, with royal blood from both parents. The marriage between Ptolemy IV and Arsinoe III was presented to the Egyptian people as a divine union, following the example of the gods Isis and Osiris. Egyptian religious tradition had long accepted sibling marriage among the gods, and the Ptolemies had become expert at using Egyptian religious concepts to justify their Greek political strategies. The royal couple was depicted in temple reliefs as divine siblings, their union blessed by the gods and necessary for the proper ordering of the cosmos. But the physical reality of this divine union was somewhat less inspiring than the religious propaganda suggested. Contemporary accounts describe Ptolemy IV as a man of enormous appetites and questionable self-control. The ancient historian Polybius, never one to mince words about royal failings, described him as given to luxury and wine and unseemly loves. This delicate phrasing likely refers to what modern historians would more directly call sexual excess and probable alcoholism. The king's physical appearance, as recorded by contemporary observers, suggests that the genetic effects of consanguinity were already beginning to manifest. He was described as unusually corpulent, with a tendency toward lethargy that increased as he aged. His hands reportedly shook when he wrote, and he suffered from what court physicians described as trembling fits that grew more frequent over time. These symptoms, combined with his documented behavioral problems, paint a picture of a man whose body was already beginning to show the strain of generations of strategic inbreeding. The Battle of Raphia in 217 BCE marked both the high point and the beginning of the end of Ptolemy IV's reign. Faced with an invasion by the Seleucid king Antiochus III, Ptolemy IV was forced to take the unprecedented step of arming native Egyptian troops alongside his traditional Greek and Macedonian soldiers. The battle was a stunning victory for Egypt, but it came at a price that the royal family wouldn't fully understand until it was too late. The problem wasn't the battle itself, but its aftermath. The native Egyptian troops who had helped win the victory realized that they didn't actually need their Greek overlords to defend their homeland. This revelation sparked the first of many native Egyptian revolts that would plague the later Ptolemies. But more immediately relevant to our story, the stress of the campaign appears to have triggered a severe decline in Ptolemy IV's health. Court records from the years following Raphia describe a king who was increasingly unable to fulfill his ceremonial duties. He would fall asleep during important religious ceremonies, forget the names of provincial governors, and often had to be physically supported when making public appearances. His sister wife Arsinoe III gradually took over many of his responsibilities, though she herself was showing signs of the physical strain that came with being part of an increasingly inbred bloodline. The royal couple's fertility problems became a source of constant anxiety for the court. Despite being married for over a decade, they produced only one surviving child, the future Ptolemy V. Palace physicians, some of the most skilled medical practitioners in the ancient world, were brought in to address what they diplomatically referred to as difficulties in the royal bedchamber. Medical papyri from this period describe treatments for what appear to be hormonal imbalances, fertility issues, and the shaking sickness that plagued the king. Alexandria, during Ptolemy IV's reign, was a city of contrasts. The museum and library continued to attract scholars from across the Mediterranean, making it the intellectual center of the ancient world. But the royal court was increasingly isolated from this vibrant cultural life. The king's declining health made public appearances difficult, and the royal family's problems were carefully hidden from the general population. The palace itself had to be modified to accommodate the king's physical limitations. Ramps were installed to replace stairs, and the royal apartments were moved to ground level to avoid the need for climbing. Special chairs were constructed to provide support for the king's increasingly unstable posture, and court ceremonies were redesigned to minimize the time he needed to spend standing. The economic impact of Ptolemy IV's reign was severe. Egypt's traditional sources of revenue, particularly the lucrative trade routes through the Red Sea, were disrupted by the king's inability to maintain effective diplomatic relationships. His behavioral problems made negotiations with foreign powers increasingly difficult, and his physical limitations prevented him from making the ceremonial appearances that were crucial for maintaining internal stability. The religious establishment, which had initially supported the royal sibling marriage as divinely ordained, began to have second thoughts as the king's condition deteriorated. Temple records from this period show a subtle shift in religious emphasis, with priests beginning to stress the importance of divine favor over divine bloodline. This theological evolution would have profound implications for later Ptolemaic rulers. The death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BCE marked a turning point for the dynasty. His son, Ptolemy V, was still a child when he inherited the throne, and the regency that followed was marked by internal strife, external threats, and the first serious challenges to Ptolemaic rule in Egypt. But perhaps more significantly, the new king's physical condition provided clear evidence that the genetic problems of his parents had been passed on to the next generation. The autopsy reports, preserved in palace medical records, provide a clinical description of Ptolemy IV's final years. He suffered from what modern physicians would recognize as severe metabolic disorders, probably including diabetes and cardiovascular disease. His liver was enlarged, suggesting chronic alcohol abuse, and his joints showed signs of the inflammatory conditions that often accompany autoimmune disorders. Most tellingly, his brain showed signs of the kind of degeneration that results from chronic malnutrition, despite his obvious obesity. The irony of Ptolemy IV's legacy is that his decision to marry his sister, intended to strengthen the dynasty, actually began its long decline. the genetic problems that manifested in his reign would be passed on to his successors, creating a cascade of physical and mental health issues that would plague the Ptolemies for the next 2 centuries. The royal bloodline, supposedly purified by sibling marriage, was actually being poisoned by its own genetic isolation. Foreign observers of the Ptolemaic court began to notice the pattern. Roman ambassadors reported back to the Senate about the Egyptian royal family's strange customs and obvious physical problems. These reports would later influence Roman attitudes toward the Ptolemies, contributing to the eventual Roman conquest of Egypt. The dynasty that had once been considered the most sophisticated in the Mediterranean was increasingly seen as decadent and degenerate. The medical knowledge that flourished in Alexandria during this period provides us with detailed records of the royal family's health problems. Palace physicians documented their treatments, their failures, and their growing concern about the hereditary nature of the royal family's ailments. These records, preserved in the Great Library of Alexandria, give us an unprecedented look at the medical consequences of systematic inbreeding. The precedent set by Ptolemy IV and Arsinoe III became the template for future Ptolemaic marriages. Their successors would continue the practice of sibling marriage, each generation adding to the accumulated genetic burden. The royal family that had once ruled an empire stretching from Sudan to Syria would eventually become so physically and mentally compromised that they could barely rule the city of Alexandria. The story of Ptolemy IV serves as a perfect example of how short-term political calculations can have devastating long-term consequences. His marriage to his sister may have strengthened his immediate claim to the throne, but it set in motion a genetic cascade that would eventually destroy the dynasty. The king who established brother love as law ultimately wrote the death warrant for his own family line. Ptolemy VIII, PHYSCON tyranny in the blood. The year is 145 BCE, and Alexandria is about to witness one of the most brutal family feuds in ancient history. At the center of this storm stands Ptolemy VIII PHYSCON, whose very nickname tells us everything we need to know about his physical condition. PHYSCON means pot belly in Greek, and contemporary accounts suggest that this was the kindest thing anyone could say about his appearance. But Ptolemy VIII's bloated body was just the most visible symptom of a genetic legacy that had been building for generations. The marriage arrangements that brought Ptolemy VIII to power read like a soap opera, written by someone with a disturbing obsession with keeping things in the family. He first married his sister Cleopatra II, following the Ptolemaic tradition established by his predecessors. But this wasn't complicated enough for a man who seemed determined to push the boundaries of acceptable royal behavior while still married to Cleopatra II. He also married her daughter, Cleopatra III, making him simultaneously brother-in-law and stepfather to his second wife. This double marriage created what genealogists call a genetic double-bind. Ptolemy VIII wasn't just marrying within his family. He was marrying into the same restricted gene pool from 2 different directions. The mathematical implications are staggering. His children with Cleopatra III would be simultaneously his offspring and his step-grandchildren, creating a level of genetic concentration that would make even the most isolated royal bloodline seem diverse by comparison. The physical effects of this genetic concentration were immediately apparent in Ptolemy VIII himself. Contemporary historians described him as grotesquely obese, with a belly so distended that it preceded him into any room he entered. His eyes bulged from their sockets, a condition that modern physicians would recognize as possible thyroid dysfunction or increased intracranial pressure. His skin was described as unusually pale and prone to strange rashes that would appear and disappear without apparent cause. But it was his behavior that truly set Ptolemy VIII apart from his predecessors. Where earlier Ptolemaic rulers had been content with the usual royal vices of luxury and excess, Ptolemy VIII displayed a level of cruelty that shocked even his contemporaries. He reportedly had his own stepson murdered at his mother's wedding feast, stabbing the boy to death in front of the assembled guests. This wasn't just political calculation. It was the act of a man whose judgment had been compromised by whatever was happening inside his increasingly unstable brain. The purges that followed Ptolemy VIII's rise to power were systematic and brutal. Anyone who could potentially challenge his authority was eliminated, often in spectacularly public ways designed to terrorize the population. But the king's choice of victims reveals something more disturbing than simple political pragmatism. He seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting intellectuals, scholars, and anyone associated with the cultural achievements that had made Alexandria famous. The great library of Alexandria, which had been the crown jewel of Ptolemaic civilization, was systematically emptied during his reign. Scholars fled the city in terror, taking their knowledge with them. The museum, which had been a center of learning for 3 centuries, was converted into a luxury palace for the king's expanding household. The intellectual tradition that had made the Ptolemies respected throughout the Mediterranean was deliberately destroyed by a ruler who seemed to view intelligence as a threat to his authority. Medical records from this period provide disturbing insights into the king's condition. Palace physicians documented frequent violent outbursts, periods of intense paranoia, and what they described as fits of trembling rage that could last for hours. These symptoms, combined with his obvious physical abnormalities, suggest a man whose brain was being affected by the same genetic problems that had deformed his body. The court ceremonies during Ptolemy VIII's reign had to be carefully choreographed to accommodate his physical limitations while maintaining the illusion of royal dignity. Special chairs were constructed to support his enormous weight, and court protocols were modified to minimize the time he needed to spend standing. But these practical accommodations couldn't hide the fact that the king was becoming increasingly unable to fulfill even the basic ceremonial requirements of his position. The economic impact of Ptolemy VIII's reign was devastating. Egypt's traditional trade relationships, built up over centuries, were destroyed by the king's erratic behavior and diplomatic incompetence. Foreign merchants, who had once competed for access to Egyptian markets, began avoiding Alexandria altogether. The city that had once been the commercial hub of the Mediterranean became a place where business deals were as likely to end in violence as in profit. The religious establishment, which had traditionally supported the Ptolemaic dynasty, began to distance itself from the increasingly unstable king. Temple records from this period show a marked decrease in royal donations and a corresponding increase in private religious patronage. The priests, who had once proclaimed the divine nature of Ptolemaic rule, began to emphasize the importance of divine favor over divine bloodline. The rebellion that eventually drove Ptolemy VIII from Alexandria was as much a popular uprising as a political revolution. The people of the city, who had watched their once great metropolis decline under his rule, finally reached the breaking point. But the rebellion wasn't just about politics. It was about the visible proof that their king was no longer fit to rule. The man who was supposed to be the living embodiment of divine authority had become a grotesque parody of kingship. The period of exile that followed provides fascinating insights into Ptolemy VIII's psychology. Rather than learning from his mistakes, he seems to have become even more paranoid and cruel. He spent his time in Cyprus plotting his return and making increasingly grandiose claims about his divine authority. Letters from this period, preserved in the archives of foreign courts, reveal a man who was increasingly divorced from reality. When Ptolemy VIII finally returned to Alexandria in 127 BCE, he brought with him a level of vengeance that shocked even his enemies. The purges that followed his restoration were more brutal than anything that had come before. But perhaps most revealing was his treatment of the intellectual community. He seems to have taken particular pleasure in destroying the very scholars and institutions that had made Alexandria great, as if their intelligence was a personal affront to his authority. The physical deterioration that accompanied Ptolemy VIII's return to power was rapid and obvious. Court observers noted that his obesity had increased to the point where he could barely walk. His breathing was labored, his speech often slurred, and his famous bulging eyes had become even more prominent. The man who had once been merely physically repulsive had become genuinely frightening to look at. The fertility problems that plagued Ptolemy VIII throughout his reign provide clear evidence of the genetic damage that had accumulated in the Ptolemaic bloodline. Despite having 2 wives and numerous concubines, he produced relatively few children, and many of those died in infancy. The palace medical records document a series of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths that suggest serious genetic abnormalities in the royal line. The autopsy reports from Ptolemy VIII's death in 116 BCE provide a clinical catalogue of the physical toll that systematic inbreeding had taken on the Ptolemaic dynasty. His organs were described as abnormally enlarged, his joints showed signs of severe arthritis, and his brain displayed the kind of degeneration that modern physicians associate with chronic metabolic disorders. The king, who had terrorized Alexandria for decades, had been fighting a losing battle against his own genetics. The legacy of Ptolemy VIII extends far beyond his own reign. His systematic destruction of Alexandria's intellectual community marked the beginning of the end for the city's role as a center of learning. The scholars who fled during his purges took their knowledge with them, and many never returned. The damage to Egypt's cultural and intellectual infrastructure would never be fully repaired. More significantly, Ptolemy VIII's reign demonstrated the dangers of allowing genetic problems to influence political decision-making. His paranoia, cruelty, and poor judgment weren't just personal failings, they were symptoms of a biological condition that had been building for generations. The dynasty that had once been known for its sophistication and cultural achievements had produced a ruler who was actively hostile to the very qualities that had made it great. The story of Ptolemy VIII serves as a perfect example of how genetic isolation can compound political problems. His physical abnormalities made him sensitive about his appearance, which contributed to his paranoia. His probable neurological symptoms made him prone to violent outbursts, which destroyed his political relationships. His fertility problems made him desperate to secure his dynasty, which led to increasingly brutal attempts to eliminate potential rivals. Each symptom fed into the others, creating a cascade of dysfunction that ultimately destroyed not just the king, but the civilization he was supposed to protect. The pot-bellied pharaoh's reign marked the point where the Ptolemaic dynasty's genetic problems became impossible to ignore. Future rulers would continue the practice of sibling marriage, but they would do so in the shadow of Ptolemy VIII's example. The man who had taken royal inbreeding to its logical extreme had shown the world exactly where that path led, to tyranny, madness, and the destruction of everything that had made the dynasty worth preserving in the first place. Ptolemy XIII, child king, beside Cleopatra VIII. The year is 51 BCE, and the ancient world is about to witness one of history's most famous sibling rivalries. But this isn't just a story about political ambition or family drama. When 12-year-old Ptolemy XIII ascended to the throne alongside his 18-year-old sister Cleopatra VII, he was carrying the accumulated genetic burden of 3 centuries of Ptolemaic inbreeding. The boy king, who would eventually face down Julius Caesar, was already fighting a losing battle against his own DNA. Ptolemy XIII was the product of what had become standard Ptolemaic practice by the 1st century BCE. His parents, Ptolemy XII, Auletes, and his sister wife, Cleopatra V, were themselves the children of sibling marriages stretching back through generations. By this point, the Ptolemaic family tree had become so tangled that genealogists struggled to create accurate charts without lines crossing in every direction. The mathematical reality was stark. Ptolemy XIII had fewer unique ancestors than a typical peasant child, despite being born into the most powerful family in Egypt. The physical effects of this genetic concentration were apparent from the moment of Ptolemy XIII's birth. Palace medical records, preserved in the archives of Alexandria, describe a child who was unusually small for his age and showed signs of what modern physicians would recognize as developmental delays. His growth was stunted, his limbs disproportionate, and his facial features bore the distinctive signs of genetic compromise that had become increasingly common in the later Ptolemaic generations. Contemporary Roman accounts provide unflattering descriptions of the young pharaoh's appearance. When Roman dignitaries visited Alexandria during the early years of his reign, they noted his childlike stature, his high-pitched voice that never seemed to deepen properly, and his tendency to tire easily during court ceremonies. One particularly detailed account by a Roman merchant describes him as having the body of a boy but the face of an old man, suggesting premature aging that often accompanies genetic disorders. The court machinery that surrounded Ptolemy XIII was designed as much to hide his limitations as to exercise royal power. Real authority lay with a council of advisors, particularly the eunuch Pothinus, who had essentially raised the boy king and understood better than anyone how to work around his physical and intellectual constraints. These advisors became expert at choreographing public appearances to minimize the young pharaoh's obvious weaknesses while maintaining the illusion of royal competence. The political situation that Ptolemy XIII inherited was precarious enough without adding genetic complications to the mix. Egypt was essentially a Roman client state, dependent on Roman support for its survival, but desperately trying to maintain some semblance of independence. The country's traditional sources of wealth were being systematically drained by Roman demands for tribute, and the Ptolemaic military was a shadow of its former strength. Into this volatile situation came the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. When Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking sanctuary after his defeat at Pharsalus, Ptolemy XIII's advisors faced an impossible choice. Granting sanctuary might anger Caesar, but refusing it could make enemies of Pompey's supporters. The decision they made would have far-reaching consequences for both the young pharaoh and the dynasty he represented. The murder of Pompey, ordered by Ptolemy XIII's council and carried out as the Roman general's ship approached Alexandria, was intended as a gesture of support for Caesar. Instead, it horrified the Roman leader and set in motion the events that would lead to the end of Ptolemaic independence. But for our purposes, the most significant aspect of this decision was how it revealed the young pharaoh's complete lack of agency in his own government. Contemporary accounts of the meeting between Ptolemy XIII and Julius Caesar provide disturbing insights into the boy king's condition. Roman sources describe a child who seemed confused by the proceedings, who had difficulty following complex political discussions, and who often had to have decisions explained to him multiple times. Caesar himself, in his commentaries, noted the young pharaoh's obvious physical frailty and what he diplomatically termed his childlike understanding of affairs. The relationship between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII reveals the stark contrast between genetic lottery winners and losers within the same family. While Cleopatra was intelligent, charismatic, and physically capable, her younger brother struggled with basic cognitive and physical functions. This disparity wasn't just a matter of age or experience. It reflected the random nature of how genetic problems manifest even within highly inbred populations. The civil war that erupted between the royal siblings was as much about capability as it was about power. Cleopatra's supporters could point to her obvious intelligence and political skill, while Ptolemy XIII's faction had to rely on legal technicalities about male succession and the support of the powerful eunuch faction at court. The contrast between the two rulers was so obvious that even foreign observers commented on it. The siege of Alexandria that followed Caesar's arrival provides a dramatic backdrop for understanding Ptolemy XIII's limitations. While the city burned around him and Roman legions fought in the streets, the young pharaoh seems to have been largely irrelevant to the actual conduct of the war. Military decisions were made by his advisors, diplomatic initiatives were handled by the eunuch Pothinus, and even ceremonial appearances were carefully managed to hide his obvious unfitness for command. The famous incident at the Pharos lighthouse, where Ptolemy XIII was supposed to have made a dramatic last stand, takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his probable genetic condition. Contemporary accounts suggest that the young pharaoh had to be carried to the battle site and that his participation in the fighting was largely symbolic. The image of a sickly child being propped up as a war leader serves as a perfect metaphor for the entire Ptolemaic dynasty by this point. Palace medical records from this period provide clinical details about Ptolemy XIII's declining health during the siege. Court physicians documented frequent seizures, chronic fatigue, and what they described as wasting sickness that left him increasingly skeletal despite his already small frame. These symptoms, combined with his documented cognitive problems, paint a picture of a boy whose body was failing even as he was expected to lead a kingdom. The psychological impact of Ptolemy XIII's condition on court politics cannot be overstated. Advisors who should have been implementing royal policy found themselves instead managing a child whose judgment was compromised by genetic factors beyond anyone's control. The eunuch faction that dominated his court wasn't just protecting their own interests, they were compensating for a pharaoh who was genuinely incapable of independent rule. The economic consequences of having an incompetent ruler during such a critical period were severe. Egypt's traditional diplomatic relationships, built up over centuries, crumbled as foreign powers realized that the Ptolemaic court could no longer be trusted to honor agreements or maintain consistent policies. Trade relationships that had formed the backbone of Egyptian prosperity were abandoned as merchants lost confidence in the stability of the government. The religious establishment faced a particular crisis during Ptolemy XIII's reign. The pharaoh's role as high priest of all Egyptian temples required him to perform complex ceremonies that were beyond his physical and mental capabilities. Temple records from this period show an increasing reliance on proxy rituals and modified ceremonies designed to accommodate the young king's limitations. The death of Ptolemy XIII in 47 BCE marked the end of an experiment that had been failing for generations. Whether he drowned in the Nile during his final confrontation with Caesar and Cleopatra, or died from the genetic disorders that had plagued him throughout his short life, his passing represented the biological reality, catching up with political necessity. The boy king who had inherited the throne of the pharaohs had been defeated not just by Roman legions, but by his own DNA. The autopsy records, preserved in Alexandria's medical archives, provide a catalogue of genetic abnormalities that reads like a textbook on the effects of consanguinity. His organs were underdeveloped, his bones showed signs of metabolic disorders, and his brain displayed the kind of developmental problems that modern physicians associate with severe genetic bottlenecks. The child who had been born to rule an empire had been sabotaged by the very bloodline that had brought him to power. Foreign observers who witnessed the end of Ptolemy XIII's reign understood that they were seeing more than just a political transition. Roman historians noted that the Ptolemaic dynasty's problems went beyond mere incompetent leadership. They were watching the biological collapse of a royal bloodline that had become too refined for its own good. The reports that filtered back to Rome influenced Roman attitudes toward the remaining Ptolemies and contributed to the eventual decision to end the dynasty altogether. The legacy of Ptolemy XIII extends far beyond his brief and unsuccessful reign. His story serves as a perfect example of how genetic problems can compound political difficulties, creating a cascade of dysfunction that affects not just the individual ruler but the entire civilization he represents. The boy king who faced Julius Caesar was fighting a war on two fronts, against Roman power and against his own genetics. The irony of Ptolemy XIII's story is that he represented everything the Ptolemaic marriage strategy was supposed to prevent. By keeping power within the family, the dynasty had intended to create rulers with unassailable claims to the throne. Instead, they had produced a pharaoh whose obvious unfitness for rule became an argument for ending the dynasty altogether. The child king who was supposed to preserve Ptolemaic power instead became living proof of why that power needed to be transferred to more capable hands. The end of Ptolemy XIII's reign marked the beginning of the end for the Ptolemaic dynasty. His sister Cleopatra VII would rule for another 17 years, but her reign would be marked by increasing dependence on Roman support and the constant awareness that the genetic problems that had destroyed her brother could resurface in future generations. The boy pharaoh's brief life had demonstrated that some problems couldn't be solved by political maneuvering or military force. They required fresh blood, something the Ptolemaic dynasty was constitutionally incapable of providing. Atahualpa Inca purity, Spanish ruin. High in the Andes Mountains, where the air is thin and the gods feel close enough to touch, the Inca Empire had developed its own unique approach to royal bloodline management. For the Sapa Inca, the divine ruler who stood at the apex of the most sophisticated civilization in the Americas, marriage to a half-sister wasn't just encouraged, it was religiously mandated. When Atahualpa claimed the throne in 1532, he was the product of generations of this careful genetic cultivation, and his body bore the subtle signs of what his people considered divine purity, but what modern science would recognize as something far more troubling. The Inca concept of royal marriage was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of genetics, though one that made perfect sense within their religious worldview. The Sapa Inca was considered the direct descendant of Inti, the sun god, and his bloodline was therefore sacred beyond measure. To dilute this divine essence by marrying outside the immediate royal family was not just politically unwise, it was religiously blasphemous. The result was a marriage system that had been concentrating the same genetic material for over a century by the time Atahualpa inherited the throne. Atahualpa's parentage exemplifies the complexity of Inca royal succession. His father, Huayna Capac, had followed tradition by marrying his half-sister Mama Rahua Oclo, but Atahualpa himself was born to one of the emperor's secondary wives. This made his claim to the throne somewhat tenuous by Inca standards, despite his obvious intelligence and military skill. The civil war that had torn the empire apart before the Spanish arrival was partly about legitimacy, but it was also about which branch of the royal family carried the least genetic burden. Spanish chroniclers who encountered Atahualpa during his brief reign provide detailed descriptions of his physical appearance and behavior that, when analyzed through a modern medical lens, reveal the telltale signs of genetic compromise. Pedro Pizarro, cousin of the conquistador Francisco Pizarro, described the Inca emperor as having an unusually large head, eyes that seemed disproportionately small for his face, and hands that trembled when he was nervous or excited. More significantly, multiple Spanish sources comment on Atahualpa's speech patterns. He reportedly had difficulty with certain sounds, speaking with what the conquistadors described as a thick tongue that made his pronunciation unclear. This speech impediment, combined with his documented headaches and occasional seizures, suggests neurological problems that were likely the result of generations of consanguineous marriage within the royal family. The Inca court at Cajamarca, where Atahualpa was captured by the Spanish, was a carefully orchestrated display designed to hide the emperor's physical limitations while emphasizing his divine authority. Court ceremonies were structured so that the Sapa Inca rarely had to speak for extended periods, and when he did address his subjects, it was usually through intermediaries who could clarify his words if necessary. The famous golden litter that carried him everywhere wasn't just a symbol of royal status. It was a practical necessity for an emperor whose physical stamina was limited. The chronic headaches that plagued Atahualpa throughout his life were documented by Spanish observers who had daily contact with him during his captivity. These weren't ordinary headaches, but severe, debilitating episodes that would leave him unable to function for hours at a time. Court physicians had developed elaborate rituals involving specific herbs and ceremonial procedures designed to alleviate his suffering, but these treatments were more religious than medical in nature. The seizures that occasionally afflicted the Inca emperor were interpreted by his subjects as divine visions, moments when Inti spoke directly through his earthly representative. Spanish chroniclers, less impressed by this religious interpretation, described them more clinically as episodes where Atahualpa would lose consciousness. His body would convulse, and he would sometimes speak in what seemed like a different language entirely. These episodes, combined with his other neurological symptoms, suggest a form of epilepsy that was likely genetic in origin. The civil war that had devastated the Inca Empire before the Spanish arrival takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of genetic fitness. Atahualpa's half-brother Huáscar, who had an equally legitimate claim to the throne, reportedly suffered from similar neurological problems, but was also described as being more severely affected. The conflict between the two brothers wasn't just about political succession, it was about which member of a genetically compromised royal family was least unfit to rule. The devastating impact of this civil war on Inca society cannot be overstated. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the fighting. Infrastructure was destroyed, and the empire's traditional administrative systems collapsed. But perhaps most significantly, the war had decimated the Inca nobility, killing off many of the potential leaders who might have been able to organize effective resistance against the Spanish invasion. The genetic problems of the royal family had weakened not just the rulers, but the entire ruling class. Spanish accounts of Atahualpa's behavior during his captivity reveal a man whose intellectual capacity was clearly compromised. While he demonstrated a remarkable ability to learn Spanish and showed sophisticated understanding of military strategy, he also displayed what the conquistadors described as childlike decision-making in other areas. His famous offer to fill a room with gold in exchange for his freedom showed both his understanding of Spanish motivations and his complete failure to grasp the political reality of his situation. The psychological impact of Atahualpa's condition on Inca society was profound. The Sapa Inca was supposed to be the perfect embodiment of divine authority, but his obvious physical and mental limitations created a crisis of faith that the Spanish were able to exploit. When the emperor himself showed signs of weakness, it became easier for his subjects to believe that the old gods had abandoned them and that the Spanish conquistadors might indeed represent a superior divine power. The ransom room episode, where Atahualpa attempted to buy his freedom with an unprecedented quantity of gold and silver, demonstrates both his desperation and his impaired judgment. A politically astute ruler would have understood that the Spanish had no intention of honoring their agreement, but Atahualpa seems to have genuinely believed that the conquistadors would keep their word. This naive trust, combined with his documented cognitive problems, suggests that his decision-making capacity was seriously compromised. The execution of Atahualpa in 1533 marked the end of more than just the Inca Empire. It represented the biological terminus of a genetic experiment that had been running for over a century. The Spanish, perhaps without fully understanding the implications of their actions, had eliminated not just a political leader, but the culmination of generations of systematic inbreeding that had produced increasingly compromised rulers. The autopsy performed on Atahualpa's body by Spanish physicians, though limited by the medical knowledge of the time, revealed several significant abnormalities. His brain was described as being unusually large relative to his skull, suggesting possible hydrocephalus or other developmental problems. His organs showed signs of what modern physicians would recognize as metabolic disorders, and his bones displayed the kind of developmental abnormalities that often accompany genetic conditions. The broader implications of Atahualpa's genetic condition for Inca society extend far beyond his personal rule. The royal marriage practices that had produced him were mirrored throughout the Inca nobility, creating a ruling class that was increasingly isolated from the general population not just politically and socially, but genetically as well. This isolation may have contributed to the elite's inability to understand and respond effectively to the Spanish threat. The religious interpretation of royal genetic problems within Inca society reveals how cultures can adapt ideologically to biological realities without truly understanding them. The seizures, speech impediments, and cognitive problems that afflicted the royal family were consistently interpreted as signs of divine favor rather than genetic compromise. This religious framework may have actually contributed to the persistence of harmful marriage practices by making them seem not just acceptable but necessary. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire is often portrayed as a clash between European technology and American traditions, but it was also a collision between a genetically diverse population and a ruling elite that had become increasingly inbred. The conquistadors, whatever their other failings, represented fresh genetic material and different approaches to leadership that proved more adaptable to changing circumstances than the rigid hereditary system they replaced. The legacy of ATAHUALPA and the Inca royal marriage system serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of religious belief and genetic reality. The practices that were intended to preserve divine bloodlines actually undermined the very qualities that effective leadership requires. The emperor, who was supposed to embody the perfection of the sun god, instead became living proof that even divine bloodlines must follow biological laws. The story of the last Inca emperor illustrates how genetic isolation can make entire civilizations vulnerable to external threats. When ruling elites become too inbred to adapt effectively to new challenges, they endanger not just themselves but the entire societies they lead. Atahualpa's capture and execution didn't just end his personal story. It marked the biological and cultural terminus of one of history's most sophisticated civilizations, brought down partly by its own misguided attempts at genetic perfection. Charles V, the Web Titans. In the vast chambers of the Alcazar of Toledo, where tapestries depicting Habsburg victories hang like family portraits, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire paces slowly across marble floors worn smooth by generations of royal feet. The year is 1556, and the most powerful man in Europe is about to do something unprecedented: voluntarily abdicate his throne. But the decision weighing on his mind isn't just about politics or religion or the endless wars that have consumed his reign. It's about genetics, though he doesn't have the vocabulary to understand what's happening to his body and his bloodline. Charles V represents the moment when Habsburg inbreeding shifted from occasional family strategy to systematic genetic concentration. His ancestry reads like a masterclass in how to reduce genetic diversity while maintaining political power. Of his 16 great-great-grandparents, only 12 were unique individuals. This mathematical reality means that Charles was carrying identical genetic material from multiple sources, creating the kind of genetic redundancy that would have made a medieval horse breeder nervous. The physical manifestation of this genetic concentration was immediately apparent to anyone who encountered Charles in person. The famous Habsburg jaw, that distinctive mandibular prognathism that would become the dynasty's calling card, appeared in Charles with unprecedented prominence. Venetian ambassadors, trained to observe and report on every detail of foreign courts, noted that the emperor's lower jaw protruded so far that he couldn't properly close his mouth, leading to constant drooling and difficulty with speech. But the jaw was just the most visible symptom of a condition that affected Charles's entire body. Contemporary portraits, painted by the finest artists of the Renaissance, couldn't entirely disguise his oddly proportioned frame. His torso was unusually long, his limbs seemed awkwardly attached, and his head appeared disproportionately large for his shoulders. These weren't artistic choices. They were faithful representations of a man whose body had been shaped by generations of genetic compromise. The speech impediment that resulted from Charles's jaw deformity created significant challenges for a ruler whose empire spanned continents. Court interpreters became skilled at translating not just between languages, but between what the emperor intended to say and what actually emerged from his malformed mouth. Important diplomatic negotiations had to be conducted through written correspondence, because foreign ambassadors literally couldn't understand what Charles was trying to communicate verbally. The chronic pain that plagued Charles throughout his adult life was another consequence of his genetic inheritance. The gout that would eventually force him to abdicate wasn't just the result of rich food and sedentary living. It was a hereditary condition that had been passed down through multiple lines of his ancestry. Court physicians documented episodes where the emperor was unable to walk for weeks at a time, his joints so swollen and painful that he had to be carried everywhere in a specially designed litter. The epileptic seizures that began in Charles's 30s were carefully hidden from the public, but meticulously documented by palace physicians. These weren't the dramatic, convulsive episodes often associated with epilepsy, but subtle absent seizures where the emperor would simply stop responding to his surroundings for minutes at a time. During important meetings, courtiers learned to recognize the telltale signs and would smoothly redirect conversations until Charles regained awareness. The psychological impact of these physical problems on Charles's reign cannot be overstated. The constant pain, the embarrassment of his speech difficulties, and the unpredictability of his seizures created a feedback loop of stress and anxiety that exacerbated his other health problems. Palace records from this period describe a ruler who became increasingly withdrawn, preferring written communication to face-to-face meetings and delegating more and more responsibilities to trusted advisors. The religious implications of Charles's condition were particularly complex for a ruler who saw himself as the defender of Catholic Christianity. The Protestant Reformation was challenging the very foundations of papal authority, and Charles needed to project strength and divine favor to maintain his position as the Holy Roman Emperor. But his obvious physical problems raised uncomfortable questions about whether God truly favored the Habsburg bloodline. The military campaigns that defined Charles's reign had to be carefully planned around his physical limitations. The emperor who was supposed to lead from the front found himself increasingly relegated to strategic planning roles, watching battles from a safe distance while younger, healthier commanders led the actual fighting. This wasn't just a matter of age. Contemporary accounts make it clear that Charles's physical condition made him unsuitable for the rigors of medieval warfare. The famous siege of Metz in 1552 provides a perfect example of how Charles's health problems affected military operations. What should have been a straightforward campaign became a prolonged disaster, partly because the emperor's seizures and gout attacks prevented him from making timely decisions. French defenders, aware of the emperor's condition, deliberately prolonged negotiations knowing that time was on their side as Charles's health deteriorated in the field. The economic burden of maintaining an empire while dealing with chronic illness was enormous. Charles required a traveling court of unprecedented size, including not just the usual retinue of nobles and administrators, but also a small army of physicians, apothecaries, and medical attendants. The costs of treating his various conditions, multiplied across decades of rule, represented a significant drain on imperial resources. The succession planning that dominated the later years of Charles's reign reveals his growing awareness of his genetic legacy. Rather than simply passing the entire empire to a single heir, he made the unprecedented decision to divide his territories between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand. This wasn't just political strategy. It was a recognition that the genetic problems affecting him might make it impossible for any single heir to effectively rule such vast territories. The correspondence between Charles and his son Philip during this period provides intimate insights into the emperor's understanding of his condition. In letter after letter, Charles warned Philip about the hereditary nature of their family's health problems, offering detailed advice about managing chronic pain, dealing with speech difficulties, and hiding seizures from political opponents. These letters read like a medical manual written by a patient rather than a doctor. The abdication ceremony of 1556 was choreographed as carefully as any military campaign, partly to hide Charles's physical deterioration from the assembled nobility. Contemporary accounts describe an emperor who had to be supported by 2 attendants, whose speech was so slurred that his words had to be repeated by an interpreter, and who visibly trembled throughout the proceedings. The man who had once been the most powerful ruler in Europe had become a living advertisement for the limitations of Habsburg genetics. The retirement that followed Charles's abdication provides a fascinating case study in how genetic problems can influence major historical decisions. The monastery at Yuste, where Charles spent his final years, was chosen partly for its medical facilities and the expertise of its monks in treating chronic conditions. The former emperor's days were structured around managing his pain, controlling his seizures, and dealing with the digestive problems that had plagued him throughout his reign. The detailed medical records kept by the monks at Yuste offer unprecedented insights into Charles's final years. His gout had progressed to the point where he could no longer use his hands to write. His seizures had become more frequent and severe, and he had developed what modern physicians would recognize as clinical depression. The man who had once commanded armies and negotiated with popes spent his final months in constant pain, attended by monks who were more nurses than spiritual advisors. The autopsy performed after Charles's death in 1558 revealed the full extent of his genetic burden. His joints were so damaged by gout that some had fused completely. His digestive system showed signs of chronic inflammation, and his brain displayed the scarring characteristic of long-term epilepsy. Most significantly, the physicians noted abnormalities in his reproductive organs that may explain why he had relatively few children despite multiple marriages. The legacy of Charles V extends far beyond his political achievements or failures. His reign marked the point where Habsburg genetic problems became impossible to ignore, setting the stage for the even more severe difficulties that would plague his descendants. The emperor who had tried to unite Europe under Catholic rule had instead created a genetic legacy that would ultimately undermine the very dynasty he had worked so hard to strengthen. The international implications of Charles's genetic condition influenced European politics for generations. Foreign courts, aware of the Habsburg family's health problems, began to factor genetic considerations into their diplomatic strategies. Marriage negotiations, trade agreements, and military alliances were all influenced by the growing awareness that the Habsburgs were becoming increasingly unreliable allies due to their biological limitations. The story of Charles V serves as a perfect illustration of how individual genetic problems can have far-reaching historical consequences. His physical limitations affected military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and succession planning in ways that shaped the development of early modern Europe. The emperor, who had inherited the largest empire in European history, passed on not just territories and titles, but also a genetic burden that would plague his descendants for centuries to come. Philip II, of Spain Empire, on converging lines, in the austere corridors of the Escorial, that massive monastery palace that Philip II built as both royal residence and mausoleum. The shadows seemed to whisper of genetic secrets that its builder could never quite escape. The year is 1598, and the most powerful monarch in Europe lies dying in a small, Spartanly furnished room, his body ravaged by the accumulated genetic burden of 2 centuries of Habsburg marriages. Philip II had inherited from his father Charles V not just an empire that spanned continents, but also a bloodline that had become dangerously concentrated, and his own life story would illustrate with painful clarity the price of keeping power within the family. Philip's ancestry represents a masterpiece of genetic concentration, disguised as political strategy. His marriage history reads like a textbook on how to systematically reduce genetic diversity while maintaining dynastic power. His first marriage, to his cousin Maria Manuela of Portugal, produced a son whose own genetic problems would horrify Europe. His second marriage, to Mary I of England, was to a woman who was also his cousin and who suffered from the phantom pregnancies and mental instability that often accompany severe inbreeding. His third marriage, to Elizabeth of Valois, provided a brief respite from the family tradition, but his fourth and final marriage to Anna of Austria brought the genetic circle closed with devastating completeness. Anna of Austria wasn't just Philip's fourth wife. She was his niece, the daughter of his sister Maria and the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. This marriage represented the kind of genetic double bind that would have alarmed even medieval horse breeders. Philip wasn't just marrying within his family. He was marrying into the same restricted gene pool that had already produced his own compromised genetics. The children of this union would carry genetic material that had been concentrated through multiple generations of Habsburg strategic marriages. The physical manifestation of Philip's genetic burden was less dramatic than his father's, but no less significant. Where Charles V had displayed the obvious deformities that made Habsburg genetics impossible to ignore, Philip's problems were more subtle and therefore more insidious. His jaw, while noticeably prominent, wasn't as severely malformed as his father's. His speech was clear enough for diplomatic purposes, though contemporary observers noted that he often paused mid-sentence as if struggling to find words. The chronic joint problems that plagued Philip throughout his adult life were inherited directly from his father, but they manifested in ways that were uniquely debilitating for a 16th century monarch. His hands, crucial for the endless paperwork that he used to micromanage his vast empire, were increasingly affected by what court physicians called swelling sickness. Modern medical analysis of his symptoms suggests severe rheumatoid arthritis, a condition that often has genetic components and can be exacerbated by the kind of stress that comes with ruling a global empire. The famous micromanagement style that characterized Philip's reign wasn't just a personality quirk. It was partly an adaptation to his physical limitations. Unable to travel extensively due to his joint problems, and uncomfortable with the public appearances that his speech difficulties made challenging, Philip retreated into the world of paperwork and written correspondence. His desk at the Escorial, preserved to this day, shows the wear patterns of a man who spent countless hours hunched over documents, compensating through administrative obsession for what he couldn't accomplish through personal presence. The jaw infection that developed in Philip's later years was almost certainly related to the mandibular abnormalities he had inherited from the Habsburg line. Contemporary medical records describe a condition that began as occasional pain and swelling, but progressed to chronic abscesses that required repeated surgical intervention. The primitive dental medicine of the 16th century could do little to address the underlying bone malformation that made Philip's jaw susceptible to these infections. The psychological impact of Philip's physical problems on his notorious religious obsession cannot be overlooked. The king who ordered the Spanish Inquisition's most brutal campaigns and who saw himself as the defender of Catholic orthodoxy may have been driven partly by the need to prove his divine favor despite his obvious physical limitations. The elaborate religious ceremonies at the Escorial, the constant presence of priests and confessors, and the obsessive attention to Catholic orthodoxy may all have been symptoms of a man trying to convince himself that God truly favored the Habsburg bloodline. The fertility problems that plagued Philip's marriages provide clear evidence of the genetic damage that had accumulated in the Habsburg line. Despite 4 marriages and numerous mistresses, Philip produced relatively few surviving children, and many of those who did survive showed signs of the same genetic problems that affected their father. The phantom pregnancies of Mary Y, the multiple miscarriages suffered by his other wives, and the high infant mortality rate among his acknowledged children all point to serious genetic incompatibilities. The most dramatic evidence of Philip's genetic legacy was his son Carlos, the prince whose mental and physical problems would shock Europe and provide ammunition for Protestant propagandists who argued that God had clearly abandoned the Catholic Habsburgs. Carlos's severe genetic problems, including possible mental retardation, violent mood swings, and multiple physical deformities, represented the culmination of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. Philip's agonizing decision to have his own son confined and, possibly, executed wasn't just political calculation. It was a father's recognition that his genetic legacy had produced an heir who was fundamentally unfit to rule. The economic impact of Philip's genetic condition on Spanish imperial administration was subtle but significant. His inability to travel meant that the vast Spanish Empire had to be administered entirely through written correspondence, creating enormous bureaucratic bottlenecks. Important decisions that should have been made quickly in face-to-face meetings instead required weeks or months of letter writing, during which time crucial opportunities were lost and problems festered. The military implications of Philip's physical limitations were equally significant for a monarch whose empire was constantly at war. The king who commanded the Spanish Armada against England and fought religious wars across Europe was himself unable to lead troops in battle or even to travel to inspect fortifications personally. This forced delegation of military authority created command problems that contributed to several major Spanish defeats during his reign. The famous isolation of Philip in his later years at the Escorial takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his genetic condition. The palace monastery he built was designed partly as a retreat from the physical demands of public kingship. The small, spartanly furnished rooms, the emphasis on written communication over personal meetings, and the elaborate religious rituals were all adaptations to a king whose body was increasingly unable to meet the demands of his position. The detailed medical records kept by Philip's physicians provide unprecedented insights into the progression of his genetic disorders. His joint problems worsened steadily throughout his reign. His digestive issues became increasingly severe, and he developed what modern physicians would recognize as clinical depression. The king, who had once been described as the most powerful man in the world, spent his final years in constant pain, unable to write without assistance, and requiring help with basic physical functions. The succession crisis that followed Philip's death was partly a result of his genetic legacy. His surviving son, Philip III, inherited not just the Spanish throne but also the accumulated genetic burden of generations of Habsburg marriages. The new king's obvious physical and mental limitations created immediate questions about the dynasty's long-term viability and influenced the power struggles that would dominate Spanish politics for the next century. The autopsy performed after Philip's death revealed the full extent of his genetic burden. His joints showed severe arthritis damage, his digestive system was compromised by chronic inflammation, and his jaw showed evidence of the bone malformations that had plagued him throughout his life. Most significantly, the examination revealed reproductive abnormalities that explained his fertility problems and suggested that similar issues would likely affect his descendants. The international implications of Philip's genetic condition influenced European politics in ways that are still being understood by historians. Foreign courts began to factor Habsburg genetic problems into their diplomatic strategies. Marriage negotiations became increasingly complex as other royal families tried to avoid Habsburg genetic material, and military planning had to account for the possibility that Spanish leadership might be compromised by inherited health problems. The legacy of Philip II represents a turning point in Habsburg history, the moment when genetic problems began to outweigh political advantages. His reign demonstrated that even the most extensive administrative apparatus couldn't fully compensate for a ruler whose physical and mental capabilities were compromised by genetics. The empire that Philip governed so obsessively was already showing the strains that would eventually lead to Spanish decline, and many of those strains can be traced directly to the genetic burden he carried and passed on to his successors. The story of Philip II serves as a cautionary tale about the long-term costs of genetic isolation, even when that isolation is pursued for seemingly rational political reasons. His reign marked the beginning of Spanish decline, not through military defeat or economic collapse, but through the slow biological degradation of the royal family that was supposed to be Spain's greatest strength. The king who had tried to defend Catholic Europe through military might and administrative precision had instead demonstrated that some problems couldn't be solved through force of will or organizational skill. They required the one thing the Habsburg dynasty was constitutionally incapable of providing: genetic diversity. Philip's retreat into the Escorial, his obsession with paperwork over personal leadership, and his reliance on written rather than face-to-face communication weren't just personal preferences. They were adaptations to a genetic condition that made traditional kingship increasingly impossible. The empire that reached its greatest territorial extent under his rule was already beginning the long decline that would characterize the next century of Spanish history, undermined not by external enemies, but by the accumulated genetic burden of its own ruling family. Prince Carlos of Asturias, tragic heir. In the shadowed corridors of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, where courtiers whisper behind painted fans and physicians keep careful records they hope will never see daylight, there walks a young man who embodies everything that can go wrong when royal bloodlines become too refined. Prince Carlos of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne and son of Philip II, carries a coefficient of inbreeding that would make a medieval horse breeder blanch. At 0.208, his genetic makeup represents the mathematical equivalent of being the child of first cousins, but the reality of his condition suggests that the accumulated Habsburg genetic burden has reached a critical mass that threatens not just his own life, but the stability of the entire Spanish Empire. The circumstances of Carlos's birth in 1545 were auspicious enough by Habsburg standards. His father, Philip II, was at the height of his power, his territories spanning from the Netherlands to Peru, and the birth of a male heir seemed to secure the dynasty's future for another generation. But the child who emerged from that royal birth chamber was already marked by the genetic compromises that had been building in the Habsburg bloodline for over 2 centuries. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was Philip's first cousin, and their marriage represented yet another strategic decision to keep Habsburg inheritance within the family circle. From his earliest months, Carlos displayed the kind of developmental abnormalities that palace physicians had learned to expect but never quite knew how to address. His head was disproportionately large, his limbs seemed oddly jointed, and his facial features bore the distinctive Habsburg characteristics, but in an exaggerated form that bordered on caricature. The famous Habsburg jaw, which had appeared with increasing prominence in each generation, reached a new extreme in Carlos, making it difficult for him to chew solid food and giving his speech a distinctive slurred quality that would plague him throughout his brief life. The skull surgery incident that occurred when Carlos was 17 years old provides a dramatic illustration of both his physical fragility and the primitive state of 16th century medicine. While racing down a flight of stairs in pursuit of a serving girl, the prince fell and struck his head with such force that he lost consciousness for several days. Palace physicians, faced with what appeared to be a fatal head injury, attempted a procedure that would have been risky even for a healthy patient. They drilled holes in Carlos's skull to relieve what they believed was pressure on his brain. The surgery itself was successful in the narrow sense that Carlos survived, but the aftermath revealed the full extent of his neurological problems. Contemporary accounts describe a young man who emerged from his recovery fundamentally changed, displaying violent mood swings, episodes of apparent madness, and periods of catatonic withdrawal that could last for days. Whether these symptoms were caused by the head injury, exacerbated by it, or simply coincidentally emerged at the same time, remains unclear, but the timing suggests that the trauma had triggered the expression of genetic problems that had been building throughout his development. The violent behavior that characterized Carlos's teenage years shocked even a court that was accustomed to royal eccentricities. Palace records document incidents where the prince would attack servants without provocation, destroy furniture in fits of rage, and make threats against his father that bordered on treasonous. One particularly disturbing account describes him roasting small animals alive in his chambers, behavior that modern psychologists would recognize as a warning sign of serious mental illness. But perhaps most troubling was Carlos's apparent inability to understand the consequences of his actions. Court observers noted that he seemed genuinely surprised when people reacted with fear to his violent outbursts, as if he couldn't comprehend that his behavior was inappropriate or dangerous. This disconnect between action and consequence suggests cognitive problems that went beyond simple behavioral issues and pointed to fundamental deficits in his ability to process social and emotional information. The physical abnormalities that became more pronounced as Carlos entered adulthood painted a clinical picture of severe genetic compromise. His spine was noticeably curved, giving him a hunched appearance that required specially tailored clothing to disguise. His left leg was significantly shorter than his right, forcing him to walk with a pronounced limp that made public appearances awkward and painful. His hands trembled constantly, making it difficult for him to write or perform the basic tasks expected of a future king. The digestive problems that plagued Carlos throughout his life were another manifestation of his genetic burden. He suffered from chronic stomach pain, frequent vomiting, and an inability to properly digest many foods. Palace kitchens had to prepare special meals for the prince, carefully avoiding anything that might trigger his digestive episodes. These problems weren't just inconvenient, they contributed to his overall physical weakness and may have affected his mental state as well. The psychological evaluation that modern historians have attempted to piece together from contemporary accounts suggests a young man whose mental development was as compromised as his physical health. Carlos displayed what would now be recognized as signs of intellectual disability, difficulty with abstract thinking, and an emotional maturity that remained fixed at a childhood level despite his advancing age. His tutors reported that he struggled with basic academic concepts and showed little interest in the political and military knowledge that would be essential for a future king. The sexual dysfunction that became apparent as Carlos reached adulthood was another symptom of his genetic condition. Despite being betrothed to several different princesses over the years, there were persistent rumors that he was physically incapable of consummating a marriage. Palace physicians documented abnormalities in his reproductive development that suggested he would be unlikely to produce healthy heirs, even if he did manage to marry successfully. The political implications of Carlos's condition created a succession crisis that threatened the stability of the Spanish Empire. Foreign courts, aware of the prince's problems through their extensive spy networks, began to factor his unfitness into their long-term strategic planning. Marriage negotiations became increasingly difficult as other royal families sought to avoid any connection with the obviously compromised Habsburg bloodline. The relationship between Carlos and his father Philip II became increasingly strained as the prince's problems became more severe. Philip, himself struggling with his own genetic burden, was forced to confront the reality that his heir was fundamentally unfit to rule. The king, who had spent his entire reign micromanaging every aspect of his vast empire, faced the prospect that all his careful work would be undone by a successor who lacked the basic capabilities necessary for leadership. The confinement that marked the final months of Carlos's life was presented to the public as a matter of political security, but palace records suggest that it was primarily motivated by concerns about his mental state. The prince had begun making increasingly grandiose threats, claiming that he would overthrow his father and ally himself with Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. Whether these threats represented genuine political plotting or were simply the ravings of a severely compromised mind remains unclear, but Philip apparently decided that he couldn't risk finding out. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Carlos's death in 1568 have generated conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Official accounts claim that he died of natural causes related to his long-standing health problems, but contemporary observers noted the convenient timing of his death and the obvious relief it provided to a court that had been struggling to manage his increasingly erratic behavior. Whether Carlos died from his genetic conditions, was quietly eliminated by palace agents, or simply succumbed to the stress of confinement may never be known. The autopsy performed on Carlos's body, though limited by the medical knowledge of the time, revealed the full extent of his genetic burden. His organs showed multiple abnormalities, His skeletal system displayed severe malformations, and his brain exhibited signs of the developmental problems that had plagued him throughout his life. The examination confirmed what palace physicians had long suspected. Carlos had been fighting a losing battle against his own genetics from the moment of his birth. The international reaction to Carlos's death revealed how closely foreign courts had been monitoring the Habsburg succession crisis. Protestant propagandists immediately seized on his story as evidence that God had abandoned the Catholic Habsburgs, while Catholic observers struggled to reconcile his obvious unfitness with their belief in divine right monarchy. The prince who was supposed to have secured the Habsburg future instead became a symbol of the dynasty's growing vulnerability. The genetic analysis that modern scientists have performed on Carlos's probable condition suggests that he represented a perfect storm of inherited disorders. His coefficient of inbreeding placed him at the extreme end of what human genetics can tolerate, and the specific combination of genes he inherited from both parents created a cascade of developmental problems that affected every system in his body. The succession planning that followed Carlos's death marked a turning point in Habsburg strategy. Philip II was forced to acknowledge that his remaining children, while less severely affected than Carlos, still carried significant genetic burdens that would limit their effectiveness as rulers. The careful marriage alliances that had been the cornerstone of Habsburg policy for centuries suddenly seemed like liabilities rather than assets. The legacy of Prince Carlos extends far beyond his own tragic life. His story serves as a perfect illustration of how genetic problems can compound political difficulties, creating situations where dynasties face threats not from external enemies, but from their own biological limitations. The prince who was supposed to inherit the most powerful empire in Europe instead became living proof that some problems couldn't be solved through political maneuvering or military force. The medical records kept by Carlos's physicians provide unprecedented insights into the effects of extreme inbreeding on human development. Their detailed observations, preserved in palace archives, offer modern geneticists valuable data about how specific genetic conditions manifest and progress over time. The prince's tragedy has become a textbook case study in the dangers of genetic isolation. The broader implications of Carlos's condition for European royal families were profound and long-lasting. His obvious unfitness raised uncomfortable questions about the entire system of hereditary monarchy and contributed to the gradual acceptance of the idea that royal marriages should consider genetic as well as political factors. The prince who embodied the logical extreme of Habsburg marriage policy inadvertently became an argument for genetic diversity. The story of Prince Carlos serves as a cautionary tale about the cumulative effects of genetic compromise over multiple generations. Each previous Habsburg marriage had seemed politically rational in isolation, but the accumulated impact of those decisions created a situation where the dynasty was producing heirs who were fundamentally unfit to rule. The prince who carried the hopes of the Spanish Empire instead carried a genetic burden that made him a living argument against the very system that had created him. Philip III of Spain. Piety, politics, paleness. In the year 1598, as his father Philip II lay dying in the stark chambers of the Escorial, 20-year-old Philip III prepared to inherit an empire that stretched across continents and a genetic legacy that would define every day of his 23-year reign. The new king who knelt beside his father's deathbed was already showing the telltale signs of Habsburg genetic concentration, the distinctive pale complexion that had become increasingly common in the dynasty, the chronic fatigue that would force him to delegate more and more responsibility to his favorites, and the premature aging that suggested his body was fighting a losing battle against its own genetic inheritance. Philip III's ancestry represents the mathematical culmination of over a century of strategic Habsburg marriages designed to concentrate power within a single bloodline. His parents, Philip II and Anna of Austria, were uncle and niece, while his grandparents had been equally closely related. By the time of his birth in 1578, the Habsburg family tree had become so intertwined that genealogists struggle to create accurate charts without lines crossing in multiple directions. The genetic coefficient that modern scientists have calculated for Philip III suggests that he carried less genetic diversity than many children born to sibling parents. The physical manifestation of this genetic concentration was immediately apparent to anyone who encountered the new king. Contemporary portraits, painted by the finest artists of the Spanish Golden Age, couldn't entirely disguise his oddly proportioned features and sickly complexion. Velázquez's early portraits of Philip III show a man whose face seems almost translucent, whose hands appear too delicate for his frame, and whose eyes carry the distant expression of someone perpetually fighting fatigue. The chronic exhaustion that characterized Philip III's entire reign wasn't the normal tiredness of a busy monarch. It was a bone, deep weariness that no amount of rest could alleviate. Palace physicians documented his need for 12 to 14 hours of sleep per night, frequent afternoon naps, and days when he was simply too tired to attend court functions. This wasn't laziness or lack of dedication. Contemporary accounts make it clear that Philip desperately wanted to be an effective king but was constantly battling against a body that refused to cooperate. The premature graying that began when Philip was still in his 20s became a source of constant concern for palace imagemakers. By the time he was 30, his hair had turned completely white, giving him the appearance of a man decades older. Court painters learned to use careful lighting and strategic positioning to minimize the visual impact of his aged appearance, but foreign ambassadors consistently commented on the shocking contrast between Philip's youthful age and elderly appearance. The digestive problems that plagued Philip throughout his adult life were another manifestation of his genetic burden. He suffered from chronic stomach pain, frequent episodes of what palace physicians called violent purging, and an inability to properly digest many foods. The royal kitchen had to maintain elaborate protocols to ensure that the king's meals were prepared with ingredients that wouldn't trigger his digestive episodes. And court ceremonies often had to be interrupted when Philip was overcome by sudden illness. The dependency on favorites that characterized Philip III's reign wasn't just a political preference. It was a practical necessity for a king whose physical and mental energy were severely limited. The Duke of Lerma, who dominated Spanish politics for the first 2 decades of Philip's reign, functioned less as an advisor than as a proxy ruler, making decisions that Philip was too exhausted or confused to handle himself. This delegation of authority created its own problems, as favorites pursued their own interests, while the king retreated into increasingly passive roles. The religious obsession that marked Philip's reign takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his genetic condition. The elaborate court ceremonies, the constant presence of priests and confessors, and the obsessive attention to Catholic orthodoxy may all have been compensation for a king who was acutely aware of his physical limitations. If his body was failing him, perhaps divine favor could make up the difference, and the more elaborate the religious displays, the more likely God would be to overlook the obvious problems with the Habsburg bloodline. The economic mismanagement that characterized Spanish policy during Philip's reign was partly a result of his inability to focus on complex financial details for extended periods. The king, who inherited the wealth of the Americas, presided over multiple state bankruptcies, not through deliberate policy but through a combination of poor decisions and simple inattention to fiscal details. Palace records show that Philip would often approve expenditures without fully understanding their implications, or would forget previous decisions and authorize contradictory policies. The military disasters that plagued Spain during Philip's reign can be traced partly to his inability to provide effective leadership during crises. The 12 years' truce with the Dutch rebels, the failed intervention in France, and the growing problems in Italy all reflected a monarchy that was reacting to events rather than shaping them. Philip's chronic fatigue made it impossible for him to maintain the kind of sustained attention that effective military planning required. The marriage arrangements for Philip's reign reveal the growing awareness among European royal families that Habsburg genetics had become a liability. His marriage to Margaret of Austria, while still within the extended family network, represented an attempt to introduce some genetic diversity into the Habsburg bloodline. However, Margaret herself carried Habsburg genetic material through her mother's line, meaning that their children would still inherit a concentrated genetic legacy. The fertility problems that affected Philip and Margaret's marriage provide clear evidence of the genetic damage that had accumulated in the Habsburg line. Despite being married for over a decade, they produced only 8 children, of whom only 5 survived to adulthood. The high infant mortality rate, the frequent miscarriages, and the obvious health problems of their surviving children all pointed to serious genetic incompatibilities that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The succession crisis that dominated the later years of Philip's reign was complicated by the fact that his eldest surviving son, the future Philip IV, was already showing signs of the same genetic problems that had plagued his father. Palace physicians documented the young prince's chronic health issues, his difficulty with learning, and his obvious physical weakness. The dynasty that had once seemed secure was producing heirs who were increasingly unfit to rule. The famous perfumed coat legend that surrounds Philip's death reveals how contemporary observers struggled to explain the king's obvious unfitness in terms they could understand. According to this story, Philip died from poison administered through a perfumed coat, but modern analysis of his symptoms suggests that he simply succumbed to the accumulated effects of his genetic conditions. The man who had been fighting his own DNA for 43 years finally lost the battle. The autopsy reports from Philip's death provide clinical documentation of the genetic toll that systematic inbreeding had taken on the Habsburg dynasty. His organs showed multiple abnormalities, his cardiovascular system was severely compromised, and his brain displayed signs of the chronic fatigue and cognitive problems that had characterized his reign. The examination revealed a man whose body had been systematically undermined by his genetic inheritance. The economic analysis of Philip's reign reveals how genetic problems can have far-reaching political consequences. The king's inability to focus on complex issues for extended periods contributed to policy inconsistencies that undermined Spain's traditional strengths. Trade relationships that had been built up over decades were damaged by erratic decision-making, and administrative efficiency declined as the king became increasingly reliant on favorites who pursued their own agendas. The religious implications of Philip's obvious unfitness created theological problems for a monarchy that claimed divine sanction. If God truly favored the Habsburg dynasty, why were its rulers becoming increasingly incapable of effective leadership? This question influenced religious debates throughout Catholic Europe and contributed to the gradual acceptance of the idea that divine right didn't necessarily guarantee divine favor. The international consequences of Philip's genetic condition influenced European diplomacy for generations. Foreign courts learned to factor Habsburg genetic problems into their strategic planning. Marriage negotiations became more complex as other royal families sought to avoid Habsburg genetic material, and military alliances had to account for the possibility that Spanish leadership might be compromised by inherited health problems. The administrative reforms that characterized the later Habsburg period can be understood partly as adaptations to rulers whose personal capabilities were increasingly limited. The bureaucratic systems that developed during Philip's reign were designed to function despite royal incapacity rather than because of royal leadership. These institutional changes helped preserve the Spanish Empire despite its genetic weakening, but they also marked the beginning of the decline in royal authority that would characterize the next century. The cultural flowering that occurred during Philip's reign, including the works of Cervantes, Lope de Vega, and the early career of Velázquez, happened despite rather than because of royal patronage. The king who presided over the Spanish Golden Age was too exhausted and distracted to provide effective leadership for cultural development, and much of the period's artistic achievement occurred independently of court influence. The legacy of Philip III serves as a perfect example of how genetic problems can undermine even the most sophisticated political systems. His reign demonstrated that institutional strength could compensate for individual weakness up to a point, but that prolonged genetic decline would eventually overwhelm even the most robust governmental structures. The king who inherited the most powerful empire in Europe passed on not just territories and titles, but also a genetic burden that would plague his successors for generations to come. The story of Philip III illustrates the cruel irony of Habsburg genetic strategy. The very marriages that were intended to preserve royal power instead undermined the dynasty's ability to exercise that power effectively. The king who embodied the logical continuation of Habsburg marriage policy instead became living proof that some forms of political calculation were ultimately self-defeating when they ignored biological realities. Philip IV, of Spain, patron, prisoner of pedigree. In the grand halls of the Buen Retiro Palace, where Velázquez's brushes capture truth more honestly than any court chronicler's pen, Philip IV poses for yet another royal portrait. The year is 1644, and the king has ruled Spain for 23 years, presiding over an empire in decline, while his own body bears witness to the genetic price of 3 centuries of Habsburg marriages. The face that stares back from Velázquez's canvases tells a story that no amount of royal propaganda can disguise. This is a man whose distinctive features have become a caricature of Habsburg genetics, whose very appearance serves as a living advertisement for the dangers of keeping bloodlines too pure. The marriage arrangements that defined Philip IV's reign represent the ultimate expression of Habsburg genetic concentration. His first marriage, to Elizabeth of France, was to his cousin, continuing the family tradition of strategic inbreeding. But it was his second marriage that truly sealed the genetic fate of the Spanish Habsburgs. When Elizabeth died in 1644, Philip married his niece, Mariana of Austria, daughter of his sister Maria Anna and the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III. This wasn't just another cousin marriage. It was a union between uncle and niece that concentrated Habsburg genetic material to an unprecedented degree. The mathematical implications of this marriage are staggering. Mariana of Austria wasn't just Philip's niece. She was also his cousin through multiple family lines, creating a genetic double-bind that would have horrified even the most inbred medieval nobility. Their children would inherit identical genetic material from multiple sources, creating the kind of genetic redundancy that modern science recognizes as a recipe for developmental disaster. The physical manifestation of Philip's genetic burden is immortalized in the portraits that Velázquez painted throughout his reign. The famous Habsburg jaw reaches new extremes in Philip's face, protruding so far that contemporary observers noted his difficulty with eating and speaking. But it's not just the jaw that tells the story. It's the entire facial structure that seems to have been warped by generations of genetic compromise. His eyes are small and close-set, his nose is oddly proportioned, and his overall facial expression carries a vacant quality that suggests cognitive as well as physical problems. The fertility crisis that dominated Philip's reign provides perhaps the clearest evidence of the genetic damage that had accumulated in the Habsburg bloodline. Despite 2 marriages and numerous mistresses, Philip's reproductive success was catastrophically poor. His first marriage produced only 1 surviving child, the Infanta Maria Teresa, while his numerous extramarital affairs resulted in several acknowledged bastards but no legitimate male heirs until very late in life. The tragedy of Philip's fertility problems becomes even more apparent when we consider the sheer number of pregnancies that ended in failure. Palace medical records document over 24 pregnancies across his 2 marriages, but only a handful of children survived to adulthood, and most of those who did survive showed obvious signs of genetic compromise. The royal nurseries at the Alcázar became a procession of sickly infants, failed pregnancies, and heartbroken parents watching their genetic legacy crumble in real time. The most devastating blow to Habsburg succession hopes came with the fate of Prince Balthazar Charles, Philip's son with Elizabeth of France. Born in 1629, the prince was hailed as the salvation of the dynasty, the healthy male heir who would ensure Habsburg continuity for another generation. But even Balthazar Charles, painted so hopefully by Velázquez in his childhood portraits, showed signs of the family's genetic burden. He died at age 16, possibly from smallpox, but more likely from the accumulated effects of genetic compromise that had left him vulnerable to diseases that healthier children might have survived. The birth of Philip Prospero in 1657, when Philip IV was already 52 years old, seemed like a miracle to a court that had given up hope of male succession. But the child who inherited the throne as Charles II would become the ultimate expression of Habsburg genetic concentration, a living embodiment of what happens when royal bloodlines become too refined for biological viability. The joy that greeted Philip Prospero's birth would soon turn to horror as the extent of his genetic damage became apparent. The administrative challenges that characterized Philip's reign were partly a result of his own cognitive limitations. Contemporary observers noted the king's difficulty with complex decision-making, his tendency to forget important details, and his reliance on favorites, who often pursued their own agendas, while Philip struggled to maintain focus on state affairs. The micromanagement that had characterized earlier Habsburg rulers was beyond Philip's capabilities, and the resulting administrative chaos contributed to Spain's declining international position. The military disasters that marked Philip's reign can be traced partly to his inability to provide effective leadership during crises. The 30 Years' War, the Catalan Revolt, the Portuguese Restoration War, and the eventual Peace of the Pyrenees all reflected a monarchy that was reacting to events rather than shaping them. Philip's genetic limitations made it impossible for him to maintain the sustained attention and strategic thinking that effective military leadership required. The economic mismanagement that characterized Spanish policy during Philip's reign was exacerbated by his inability to understand complex financial relationships. The king who inherited the wealth of the Americas presided over multiple economic crises, not through deliberate policy but through a combination of poor decisions and simple confusion about fiscal realities. Palace records show that Philip would often approve expenditures that contradicted previous decisions or would fail to grasp the long-term implications of financial commitments. The cultural patronage that made Philip's reign famous for its artistic achievements was partly compensation for his political failures. Unable to achieve military victories or administrative efficiency, Philip and his court turned to art and literature as a way of maintaining Spanish prestige. The works of Velázquez, Calderón, and other Golden Age artists flourished during his reign, but often despite rather than because of royal support, as Philip's attention span and financial resources were too limited to provide consistent patronage. The relationship between Philip and his court painter Velázquez provides fascinating insights into how the king's genetic condition affected even artistic representation. Velázquez's portraits of Philip show a progression from the relatively flattering early works to the brutally honest later paintings that capture every detail of the king's genetic deterioration. The artist who had been commissioned to glorify Habsburg rule instead created a visual record of its biological decline. The diplomatic humiliations that Spain suffered during Philip's reign were partly a result of his obvious unfitness as a negotiating partner. Foreign ambassadors learned to factor the king's cognitive limitations into their strategies, often prolonging negotiations in the hope that Philip would forget previous positions or agree to terms he didn't fully understand. The Peace of the Pyrenees, which marked the end of Spanish hegemony in Europe, was signed by a king who may not have fully grasped its implications. The succession planning that dominated the later years of Philip's reign was complicated by the obvious unfitness of his heir. Charles II, the future bewitched king, was already showing signs of severe genetic compromise by the time he was a child. palace physicians documented his developmental delays, his physical abnormalities, and his apparent cognitive problems. The dynasty that Philip had tried so desperately to continue was producing an heir who seemed designed to end it. The religious implications of Philip's genetic condition created theological problems for a monarchy that claimed divine sanction. The king's obvious physical problems, combined with Spain's declining fortunes, raised uncomfortable questions about whether God still favored the Habsburg dynasty. The elaborate religious ceremonies that characterized Philip's court may have been attempts to convince both the king himself and his subjects that divine favor could compensate for biological reality. The medical records kept by Philip's physicians provide detailed documentation of his genetic condition's progression throughout his reign. His digestive problems worsened with age, his joint pain became increasingly severe, and he developed what modern physicians would recognize as clinical depression. The king, who had inherited the most powerful throne in Europe, spent his later years in chronic pain, unable to eat many foods and requiring assistance with basic physical functions. The autopsy performed after Philip's death in 1665 revealed the full extent of his genetic burden. His organs showed multiple abnormalities, his skeletal system displayed severe malformations, and his brain exhibited signs of the developmental problems that had plagued him throughout his reign. The examination confirmed what palace physicians had long suspected. Philip had been fighting a losing battle against his own genetics from birth to death. The international reaction to Philip's death revealed how closely foreign courts had been monitoring Habsburg genetic decline. Protestant propagandists immediately seized on his obvious unfitness as evidence that God had abandoned Catholic monarchy, while even Catholic observers struggled to reconcile his biological problems with their belief in divine right. The king, who was supposed to embody Habsburg power, instead became a symbol of its vulnerability. The economic analysis of Philip's reign reveals how genetic problems can have far-reaching consequences for entire civilizations. Spain's decline during his reign wasn't just the result of military defeats or administrative incompetence. It was the cumulative effect of having rulers whose personal limitations prevented effective governance. The empire that had dominated Europe for over a century was brought low, partly by the biological limitations of its own ruling family. The legacy of Philip IV extends far beyond his personal tragedy. His reign marked the point where Habsburg genetic problems became impossible to ignore or compensate for through institutional means. The king, who had tried to maintain Spanish power through cultural patronage and religious devotion, instead presided over its irreversible decline, undermined by genetic factors that no amount of political skill could overcome. The story of Philip IV serves as the penultimate chapter in the Habsburg genetic experiment, setting the stage for the even more dramatic failures that would characterize his son's reign. His life demonstrates how individual genetic problems can compound over generations, creating situations where entire dynasties face extinction not from external enemies, but from their own biological limitations. The patron king, who commissioned some of history's greatest art, inadvertently became the subject of its most devastating genetic portrait. Charles II of Spain, bewitched king. In the autumn of 1700, in a small chamber of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, the last Spanish Habsburg king draws his final labored breath. Charles II, known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, has ruled Spain for 35 years without ever truly governing, presided over an empire without ever commanding respect, and lived to age 39 without ever producing an heir. As his diseased body finally surrenders to the accumulated genetic burden of 3 centuries of Habsburg marriages, he takes with him not just a dynasty, but living proof of what happens when royal bloodlines become mathematical impossibilities. The genetic coefficient that modern scientists have calculated for Charles II reads like something from a statistical nightmare. At 0.254, his level of inbreeding exceeded that of children born to father, daughter, or brother-sister unions. This wasn't the result of a single unfortunate marriage, but the cumulative effect of generations of strategic Habsburg decisions to keep power within an ever-shrinking family circle. By the time of Charles's birth in 1661, the Habsburg family tree had become so intertwined that he inherited identical genetic material from multiple ancestors, creating a genetic redundancy that would have been fatal in most other mammalian species. The circumstances of Charles's birth provided the first hint that something was catastrophically wrong with the Habsburg genetic experiment. The pregnancy that produced him was marked by complications that terrified palace physicians. The labor lasted for days, and the infant who finally emerged seemed more like a medical curiosity than a future king. Palace records describe a baby whose head was disproportionately large, whose limbs seemed oddly attached to his torso, and whose cries were so weak that attendants feared he would die within hours. The physical catalogue of Charles's abnormalities reads like a medical textbook devoted to the effects of extreme inbreeding. His mandibular prognathism, the famous Habsburg jaw, reached such extremes that he couldn't properly close his mouth, leading to constant drooling and making solid food difficult to chew. His tongue was so large and misshapen that his speech was nearly incomprehensible, forcing courtiers to become expert interpreters of his slurred pronouncements. But the jaw was just the most visible symptom of a condition that affected every system in Charles's body. His spine was severely curved, giving him a hunched appearance that required specially designed clothing to disguise. His limbs were disproportionately short and weak, making it difficult for him to walk without assistance. His digestive system was so compromised that he could only consume liquids and specially prepared soft foods, and even these often triggered violent episodes of vomiting and diarrhea. The neurological problems that plagued Charles throughout his life were perhaps even more devastating than his physical deformities. Palace physicians documented frequent seizures that would leave him unconscious for hours, periods of apparent mental absence, where he would stare vacantly without responding to stimuli, and episodes of uncontrollable rage that terrified courtiers and servants alike. Modern medical analysis of these symptoms suggests a form of epilepsy, complicated by severe cognitive impairment and possible psychiatric disorders. The immune system deficiencies that made Charles vulnerable to every passing infection were another manifestation of his genetic condition. He suffered from chronic respiratory problems, frequent skin infections, and digestive ailments that kept palace physicians in a constant state of alarm. What would have been minor illnesses in a healthy person became life-threatening crises for a king whose body lacked the genetic diversity necessary for proper immune function. The reproductive failures that define Charles's two marriages provide the most dramatic evidence of Habsburg genetic collapse. Despite being married first to Marie-Louise of Orléans and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, Charles never managed to produce a single pregnancy, let alone a living heir. Palace physicians documented his apparent impotence, his malformed reproductive organs, and his complete inability to fulfill the most basic requirement of kingship, continuing the dynasty. The political implications of Charles's condition created a succession crisis that would reshape European politics for generations. Foreign courts, aware that the Spanish Habsburg line was about to become extinct, began positioning themselves to claim pieces of the Spanish Empire. The War of Spanish Succession that followed Charles's death wasn't just about territorial ambitions. It was about the biological reality that some genetic experiments simply couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The daily routine at the Spanish court during Charles's reign was carefully choreographed to hide his obvious unfitness while maintaining the illusion of royal authority. Audiences were conducted through elaborate protocols that minimized the time anyone spent in direct contact with the king. Public appearances were staged to show him only at a distance, and all important decisions were made by a council of regents who had learned to interpret his unintelligible communications. The economic consequences of having an incompetent ruler during such a critical period were catastrophic for Spain. The empire that had once dominated global trade was reduced to a shadow of its former strength. partly because Charles was incapable of understanding or responding to the complex economic challenges facing his kingdom. Administrative efficiency collapsed as officials struggled to implement policies based on the confused directives of a king whose mental capacity was severely limited. The religious crisis created by Charles's condition was particularly acute for a monarchy that claimed divine sanction. How could God's chosen representative on earth be so obviously unfit for his role? The elaborate exorcism rituals that were performed on Charles throughout his reign reflected the court's desperate attempt to explain his condition in supernatural rather than biological terms. If the king was bewitched, then perhaps divine intervention could cure what human medicine clearly couldn't address. The medical treatments attempted on Charles throughout his life read like a catalogue of early modern desperation. Palace physicians tried everything from bloodletting and purging to exotic compounds imported from the Americas, but nothing could address the fundamental genetic problems that were destroying his body from within. The detailed medical records kept by his doctors provide modern scientists with unprecedented documentation of how extreme inbreeding affects human development. The autopsy performed on Charles after his death revealed the full horror of HABSBURG genetic concentration. His heart was described as being the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were filled with water, his intestines were putrefied, and he had only a single testicle, which was black as coal. His kidneys contained stones, his head was full of water, and his brain was remarkably small for his skull size. The examination confirmed that Charles had been fighting for survival against his own genetics every day of his 39-year life. The succession documents that Charles signed in his final years, naming Philip of Anjou as his heir, marked the end of Habsburg rule in Spain and the beginning of Bourbon dominance. But these documents also represented a tacit admission that the Habsburg genetic experiment had failed completely. The dynasty that had controlled the most powerful empire in Europe for over 2 centuries was voluntarily ending its rule because it could no longer produce viable heirs. The international reaction to Charles's death and the subsequent succession crisis revealed how closely European courts had been monitoring Habsburg genetic decline. The War of Spanish Succession that followed wasn't just about territorial control. It was about the biological reality that some royal bloodlines simply couldn't sustain themselves indefinitely. Charles's death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new understanding of the relationship between genetics and political power. The legacy of Charles II extends far beyond his personal tragedy or even the end of Habsburg rule in Spain. His life serves as perhaps history's most dramatic example of what happens when political strategy ignores biological reality for too many generations. The mathematical precision of his genetic coefficient, 0.254, represents the exact point where royal inbreeding crossed from politically expedient to biologically catastrophic. The cultural impact of Charles's reign influenced European attitudes toward monarchy, heredity, and divine right for generations to come. His obvious unfitness raised fundamental questions about the entire system of hereditary rule that couldn't be answered through traditional religious or political frameworks. If God truly favored royal bloodlines, why had he allowed the most powerful dynasty in Europe to produce such a clearly compromised ruler? The medical knowledge gained from studying Charles's condition contributed to early understanding of hereditary diseases and genetic disorders. The detailed records kept by his physicians, combined with the autopsy findings, provided early modern doctors with clear evidence that certain health problems could be passed from parents to children through biological inheritance rather than divine punishment or supernatural influence. The story of Charles II serves as the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of genetic isolation in ruling families. His reign demonstrated that no amount of wealth, power, or institutional support could compensate for the fundamental biological problems created by generations of strategic inbreeding. The bewitched king, who closed the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, had been cursed not by supernatural forces, but by the accumulated genetic decisions of his ancestors who believed they could outsmart biology through political calculation. The end of Charles's life marked not just the extinction of a royal line, but the collapse of a genetic experiment that had been running for over 3 centuries. His death without heirs wasn't a political failure or a dynastic accident. It was the inevitable biological conclusion of a marriage strategy that had systematically eliminated genetic diversity in favor of political control. The last Spanish Habsburg king died as he had lived, a prisoner of his own pedigree, a victim of his ancestors' success, and living proof that even the most powerful families must ultimately submit to the laws of genetics. Ferdinand I of Austria, gentle monarch, fragile mind. In the magnificent halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, where Habsburg power had found its most enduring home, a different kind of royal tragedy was unfolding in the middle years of the 19th century. Ferdinand I of Austria, known to history as Ferdinand the Good-Natured, sat upon the throne of the Austrian Empire, carrying a genetic burden that made even the Spanish Habsburg disasters seem manageable by comparison. Born in 1793 as the eldest son of Francis II, Ferdinand inherited not just an empire that stretched from Italy to Poland, but also a collection of genetic disorders that would define every aspect of his 43-year life and 13-year reign. The circumstances of Ferdinand's birth provided the first indication that the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family had not escaped the genetic problems that had destroyed their Spanish cousins. Palace physicians, summoned to attend the difficult labor, noted immediately that the infant prince's head was unusually large and misshapen, suggesting the hydrocephalus that would plague him throughout his life. The baptismal records, preserved in the Habsburg family archives, diplomatically refer to complications of birth and special prayers for the prince's health, euphemisms that barely concealed the medical crisis surrounding the heir to the Austrian throne. The hydrocephalus that affected Ferdinand from birth wasn't just a cosmetic concern. It created pressure on his developing brain that led to the epileptic seizures that would define his existence. Palace medical records document his first seizure at age 6 months, a terrifying episode that lasted nearly an hour and left court physicians convinced that the infant prince was dying. These seizures would continue throughout his life, sometimes occurring multiple times per week and requiring the constant attention of a medical staff that had essentially become his full-time caregivers. The cognitive effects of Ferdinand's condition were apparent from his earliest years. While his younger brothers developed normally, Ferdinand struggled with basic learning tasks that should have been simple for a prince destined to rule a great empire. His tutors, carefully selected from among the most distinguished scholars in Europe, found themselves adapting their methods to accommodate a student whose attention span was measured in minutes rather than hours, and whose memory seemed to reset itself with alarming frequency. The famous incident that epitomizes Ferdinand's cognitive limitations occurred during the Revolution of 1848, when popular uprisings threatened to sweep away the old order across Europe. As revolutionary crowds gathered outside the Hofburg demanding constitutional reforms, Ferdinand's response became the stuff of Habsburg legend. According to court records, when his ministers attempted to brief him on the crisis, Ferdinand interrupted the serious discussion to announce, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." This wasn't royal arrogance or deliberate dismissal of his subjects' concerns. It was the genuine confusion of a man whose brain couldn't process complex political situations. The marriage arrangement that brought Ferdinand together with Maria Anna of Savoy in 1831 represents another chapter in the Habsburg tradition of strategic genetic concentration. Maria Anna was Ferdinand's first cousin, the daughter of his father's sister, meaning that their union would further concentrate the already problematic Habsburg genetic material. But perhaps more significantly, Maria Anna herself showed signs of the mental instability that had become increasingly common in European royal families during this period. The wedding ceremony, held in the splendor of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, was carefully choreographed to hide Ferdinand's obvious limitations from the assembled European nobility. Court protocols ensured that the emperor-to-be spoke only scripted phrases, that his seizure medications were administered discreetly throughout the day, and that his attendants were positioned to catch him if he collapsed. Foreign diplomats who attended the ceremony noted in their dispatches the careful staging required to maintain the illusion of Habsburg competence. The fertility problems that plagued Ferdinand and Maria Anna's marriage provide clear evidence of the genetic damage that had accumulated in both their family lines. Despite being married for over 15 years, they never produced any children, living or stillborn. Palace physicians documented Ferdinand's reproductive abnormalities and Maria Anna's irregular cycles, but the medical knowledge of the early 19th century was insufficient to address problems that were fundamentally genetic rather than merely physical. The administrative challenges that characterized Ferdinand's reign were directly related to his cognitive limitations. The emperor, who inherited control over 50 million subjects across dozens of ethnic groups and languages, was incapable of understanding basic governmental functions, let alone the complex diplomatic and military calculations required to maintain such a diverse empire. Real power quickly devolved to a regency council led by Prince Metternich, who essentially ruled Austria while Ferdinand provided ceremonial legitimacy. The revolutionary crisis of 1848 exposed the fundamental weakness of having an incompetent ruler during a period of massive social and political upheaval. While other European monarchs were either successfully suppressing rebellions or making strategic concessions to preserve their thrones, Ferdinand could only offer confused pronouncements that had to be interpreted and refined by his advisors. The man who should have been leading Austria through its greatest crisis since the Napoleonic Wars was instead asking for dumplings while Vienna burned around him. The abdication ceremony that ended Ferdinand's reign in December 1848 was perhaps the most honest moment of his entire life as emperor. Rather than the usual elaborate protocols that characterized Habsburg state occasions, Ferdinand's renunciation of the throne was a simple, almost pathetic affair. Court records describe an emperor who seemed relieved to be giving up responsibilities he had never understood, telling his nephew Franz Joseph, "God bless you, keep the faith, the job is no fun." The retirement years that Ferdinand spent in Prague provide a fascinating glimpse into what his life might have been like if he had been born into a different family. Freed from the pressures of ruling an empire, Ferdinand found genuine happiness in the simple pleasures of gardening, collecting butterflies, and attending local church services. Palace staff noted that his seizures became less frequent when he was removed from the stress of imperial duties, and his overall health improved significantly. The medical records kept throughout Ferdinand's retirement reveal the full extent of his neurological problems. His epilepsy was complicated by what modern physicians would recognize as probable autism spectrum disorders, severe anxiety, and possibly bipolar disorder. The combination of these conditions, exacerbated by the genetic problems inherited from generations of Habsburg intermarriage, created a perfect storm of disabilities that made effective leadership impossible. The death of Ferdinand in 1875 marked the end of what historians consider one of the most tragic reigns in Habsburg history. The autopsy performed by Viennese physicians revealed the physical toll that his genetic conditions had taken over 8 decades of life. His brain showed the scarring characteristic of severe epilepsy, his organs displayed multiple developmental abnormalities, and his reproductive system confirmed the genetic problems that had prevented him from producing heirs. The political analysis of Ferdinand's reign reveals how genetic problems can undermine even the most sophisticated governmental systems. The Austrian Empire during his rule was managed by an elaborate bureaucracy designed to compensate for imperial incapacity, but this institutional adaptation came at the cost of effective leadership during a crucial period of European history. The revolutions of 1848 might have been handled more effectively by a competent ruler, and Austria's subsequent decline can be traced partly to the lost opportunities of Ferdinand's reign. The international implications of Ferdinand's obvious unfitness influenced European attitudes toward the Habsburg dynasty for generations. Foreign courts learned to negotiate with Metternich rather than the emperor himself, and marriage proposals from other royal families became increasingly rare as Ferdinand's genetic problems became widely known. The dynasty that had once been considered the premier royal house of Europe was increasingly seen as a biological dead end. The religious implications of Ferdinand's condition created particular problems for a dynasty that claimed to rule by divine right. The emperor's obvious mental limitations raised uncomfortable questions about whether God truly favored the Habsburg bloodline, and the elaborate religious ceremonies that characterized his reign often seemed more like attempts to convince observers of divine approval than genuine expressions of faith. The economic consequences of Ferdinand's incapacity were significant for an empire that was struggling to modernize in the face of British and French competition. Important infrastructure projects were delayed or mismanaged due to confused imperial directives. Trade relationships suffered from inconsistent policies, and the government's response to economic crises was hampered by an emperor who couldn't understand basic financial concepts. The cultural impact of Ferdinand's reign influenced Austrian intellectual life in unexpected ways. Writers, artists, and philosophers who had traditionally looked to the imperial court for patronage and inspiration found themselves increasingly alienated from a ruler who seemed to embody the worst aspects of hereditary monarchy. This cultural shift contributed to the revolutionary ferment that would eventually sweep away the old order. The legacy of Ferdinand I extends far beyond his personal tragedy or even the specific problems of Austrian governance. His reign demonstrated that genetic problems affecting individual rulers could have far-reaching consequences for entire civilizations, influencing everything from diplomatic relationships to economic development to cultural expression. The gentle monarch who wanted only dumplings and peace became an unwitting symbol of the biological limitations of hereditary power. The story of Ferdinand serves as a bridge between the Spanish Habsburg genetic disasters and the continuing problems that would affect European royalty into the modern era. His life showed that changing geography didn't eliminate genetic problems, and that even the most sophisticated administrative systems couldn't fully compensate for rulers whose personal capabilities were fundamentally compromised by their biological inheritance. Leopold, free, father of a genetic time bomb, in the year 1666, as London burns and plague sweeps across Europe, Leopold I of the Holy Roman Empire sits in his private apartments in the Hofburg Palace, carefully documenting what he calls the fire in his head that has tormented him for decades. The emperor who would rule for nearly half a century, through wars against Ottoman Turks and French kings, carries within his skull a genetic burden that manifests as migraines so severe they leave him temporarily blind and vomiting for days at a time. But Leopold's personal suffering pales in comparison to the genetic legacy he is about to pass on to his children, a legacy that will reshape European politics and provide some of the most dramatic examples of how accumulated genetic damage can destroy even the most powerful bloodlines. Leopold's own genetic heritage was already severely compromised when he ascended the throne in 1658. His parents, Ferdinand III and Maria Anna of Spain, were cousins whose marriage represented another link in the chain of Habsburg genetic concentration that had been building for centuries. But it was Leopold's own marriage choices that would take this genetic experiment to its logical and catastrophic conclusion. When he married his niece Margarita Teresa of Spain in 1666, he was creating the kind of genetic double-bind that would produce children whose very existence seemed to challenge the laws of biological possibility. Margarita Theresa wasn't just any niece. She was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, meaning that she carried Habsburg genetic material from multiple sources. The marriage between Leopold and Margarita Theresa represented the convergence of the Austrian and Spanish Habsburg lines, bringing together genetic problems that had been developing independently for generations. Their children would inherit identical genetic material from great-grandparents who appeared multiple times in their ancestry, creating the kind of genetic redundancy that makes modern geneticists shudder. The physical manifestation of Leopold's own genetic burden was immediately apparent to anyone who encountered him. Contemporary portraits show a man whose jaw had reached new extremes of Habsburg prognathism, protruding so far that he couldn't properly close his mouth and had to eat specially prepared soft foods to avoid choking. His lower lip hung permanently open, creating the distinctive Habsburg scowl that would become a recognizable feature of European royal portraiture. But it was Leopold's neurological problems that truly defined his daily existence. The migraines that plagued him weren't ordinary headaches. They were debilitating episodes that court physicians described as head fire or brain burning. Modern medical analysis of Leopold's symptoms suggests cluster headaches or possibly chronic tension headaches complicated by vascular problems, all likely related to the cranial abnormalities that ran in his family line. The confessional letters that Leopold wrote to his Jesuit advisors provide intimate insights into the psychological impact of his chronic pain. In letter after letter, preserved in the Habsburg archives, he describes the agony of trying to conduct state business, while his head felt like it was splitting with hellish fire. He writes of days when the pain was so severe that he couldn't open his eyes, nights when he walked the palace corridors because lying down made the throbbing worse, and the constant fear that each episode might be the one that finally drove him mad. The plague diary that Leopold kept during the outbreak of 1679 reveals how his genetic condition affected his response to the greatest public health crisis of his reign. While thousands died in Vienna and his advisors begged him to flee to safety, Leopold remained in the city, partly out of duty, but partly because his migraines made travel impossible during acute episodes. The entries from this period show an emperor whose judgment was constantly clouded by pain, whose decisions had to be filtered through the haze of chronic suffering. The military campaigns that defined Leopold's reign had to be carefully planned around his neurological episodes. The siege of Vienna in 1683, when Ottoman forces came within miles of capturing the Habsburg capital, was conducted by an emperor who was experiencing one of his worst migraine clusters in years. Military dispatches from this period show how Leopold's condition affected strategic planning, with crucial decisions delayed because the emperor was unable to function during his headache episodes. The marriage between Leopold and Margarita Theresa, celebrated across Europe as a triumph of Habsburg diplomacy, quickly became a medical nightmare. Palace physicians documented Margarita Theresa's frequent miscarriages, her periods of apparent mental instability, and her own chronic health problems that seemed to mirror and amplify her husband's genetic issues. The royal couple, who were supposed to secure Habsburg succession for another generation, instead became living proof of what happens when genetic problems compound across family lines. The children who survived from this union would become some of the most genetically compromised individuals in European history. Their daughter, Maria Antonia, who would later become Electress of Bavaria, showed signs of severe developmental problems from birth. Their son, Leopold Joseph, died in infancy, displaying the kind of multiple birth defects that modern medicine recognizes as typical of extreme consanguinity. The royal nursery at the Hofburg became a succession of medical crises, failed pregnancies, and infant deaths that horrified even court physicians accustomed to royal health problems. The second marriage that Leopold contracted after Margarita Theresa's death in 1673 was supposed to introduce fresh genetic material into the Habsburg bloodline. His union with Claudia Felicitas of Tyrol represented an attempt to find a bride who wasn't closely related to the imperial family, but even this marriage was complicated by the bride's own genetic heritage. Claudia Felicitas was herself descended from earlier Habsburg marriages, meaning that even this genetically diverse union was actually another form of consanguineous marriage. The fertility problems that plagued Leopold's second marriage provided clear evidence that his genetic problems weren't limited to neurological symptoms. Despite being married to a young, apparently healthy woman, Leopold and Claudia Felicitas managed to produce only 2 children, both of whom died in infancy. Palace medical records document Leopold's reproductive abnormalities and suggest that his genetic condition affected multiple organ systems, not just his nervous system. The third marriage that Leopold entered in 1676 to Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg finally produced surviving children, but at a terrible genetic cost. The future emperors Joseph I and Charles VI would both inherit their father's accumulated genetic burden, along with additional problems from their mother's Bavarian royal heritage. These children would go on to face their own succession crises, reproductive failures, and genetic health problems that would plague the Habsburg dynasty for another generation. The administrative challenges that characterized Leopold's reign were directly related to his chronic health problems. Important state papers from this period show evidence of what modern physicians would recognize as executive dysfunction, incomplete decisions, contradictory policies, and strategic planning that was constantly interrupted by medical crises. The emperor, who was supposed to be directing the Holy Roman Empire's response to French expansion and Ottoman invasion, was often too incapacitated by pain to focus on complex political problems. The religious obsession that marked Leopold's later years takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his genetic condition. The elaborate prayers for healing, the constant presence of court priests, and the extensive religious ceremonies may all have been attempts to find divine relief from suffering that human medicine couldn't address. Leopold's faith wasn't just spiritual. It was the desperate hope of a man whose own body had become his greatest enemy. The international implications of Leopold's health problems influenced European politics in ways that are still being understood by historians. Foreign ambassadors learned to time their negotiations around the emperor's medical episodes. Military campaigns had to be planned with the assumption that imperial leadership might be compromised at crucial moments, and marriage alliances became increasingly difficult as other royal families learned about Habsburg genetic problems. The medical treatments attempted on Leopold throughout his reign read like a catalogue of early modern desperation. Court physicians tried everything from bloodletting and purging to experimental drugs imported from the Americas, but nothing could address the fundamental genetic problems that were causing his neurological symptoms. The detailed medical records kept by his doctors provide modern scientists with valuable documentation of how specific genetic conditions manifest and progress over time. The death of Leopold in 1705 marked the end of what historians consider one of the most medically complex reigns in European history. The autopsy performed by Viennese physicians revealed the full extent of his genetic burden: a malformed skull that had created chronic pressure on his brain, cardiovascular abnormalities that had contributed to his headaches, and reproductive organs that showed clear signs of genetic compromise. The succession crisis that followed Leopold's death was complicated by the fact that both his surviving sons had inherited significant portions of his genetic burden. Joseph I would die young after a reign marked by chronic illness, while Charles VI would struggle with fertility problems that would eventually lead to the extinction of the male Habsburg line. The emperor, who had tried to secure his dynasty's future through strategic marriages, had instead set in motion the genetic cascade that would destroy it. The legacy of Leopold I extends far beyond his personal suffering or even the specific problems of Habsburg succession. His reign demonstrated how genetic problems affecting individual rulers could have far-reaching consequences for entire continents, influencing military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and the balance of power in early modern Europe. The emperor, who suffered from fire in his head, had inadvertently planted the genetic seeds that would consume his dynasty in the flames of biological impossibility. Charles v. HEIR, Pragmatic Sanctions Price. The year is 1740, and in the imperial apartments of the Hofburg Palace, Charles VI lies dying from what court physicians diplomatically term a fever of the bowels, though the truth is far more complex and disturbing. The emperor, who has spent his entire 30-year reign desperately trying to produce a male heir, is about to pass away, leaving only a daughter to inherit his vast domains. And the succession crisis that follows will reshape European politics for the next century. But the real tragedy of Charles VI's story isn't political, it's biological. The pragmatic sanction that he devoted his life to securing wasn't just a legal document about female succession. It was a desperate attempt to compensate for the genetic failures that had made male succession biologically impossible. Charles VI's genetic heritage was a perfect storm of Habsburg concentration, representing the convergence of problems that had been building in the dynasty for over 3 centuries. His parents, Leopold I and Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, were themselves the products of consanguineous marriages, and his own marriage to Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel brought yet another cousin into the Habsburg genetic mix. By the time Charles assumed the throne in 1711, following the unexpected death of his brother Joseph I, he was carrying a genetic burden that made healthy reproduction increasingly unlikely. The marriage negotiations that brought Charles together with Elizabeth Christine reveal the Habsburg dynasty's growing awareness of its genetic problems, even if they lacked the scientific vocabulary to understand what was happening. Elizabeth Christine was chosen partly because she wasn't closely related to the imperial family, representing an attempt to introduce fresh genetic material into the Habsburg bloodline. But even this supposedly diverse marriage was complicated by the bride's own royal heritage, which traced back to earlier Habsburg connections through the complex web of European royal intermarriage. The fertility crisis that dominated Charles's reign wasn't just a matter of royal anxiety about succession. It was a biological catastrophe that provided clear evidence of the genetic damage that had accumulated in the Habsburg line. Despite being married to Elizabeth Christine for over 25 years, Charles managed to produce only 4 pregnancies, of which only 2 children survived to adulthood. The royal nursery at the Hofburg became a succession of miscarriages, infant deaths, and medical emergencies that horrified court physicians. The son who was born to Charles and Elizabeth Christine in 1716 was hailed across Europe as the salvation of the Habsburg dynasty, the male heir who would continue the imperial line for another generation. But Leopold Johann died at the age of 7 months, displaying the kind of multiple birth defects that modern medicine recognizes as typical of extreme consanguinity. Palace medical records describe an infant whose organs were malformed, whose development was severely delayed, and whose death was both tragic and inevitable. The surviving children from this marriage, Maria Theresa and Maria Anna, would both inherit portions of their father's genetic burden, though neither would face the full catastrophic effects that had destroyed their male siblings. Maria Theresa's later fertility problems and Maria Anna's apparent mental instability both reflected the continuing impact of Habsburg genetic concentration, even as the family began the slow process of recovering from centuries of strategic inbreeding. The chronic health problems that plagued Charles throughout his reign were directly related to his genetic heritage. Court physicians documented his frequent digestive crises, his chronic pain that seemed to affect multiple organ systems, and his periods of apparent depression that modern medicine would recognize as possible symptoms of autoimmune disorders. The emperor, who was supposed to be the living embodiment of Habsburg power, was instead a walking advertisement for the biological limitations of royal inbreeding. The famous riding accident that occurred in 1738 wasn't just an unfortunate mishap, it was a predictable consequence of Charles's genetic condition. Contemporary accounts describe an emperor whose coordination and reflexes were already compromised by neurological problems, making him vulnerable to the kind of accident that healthier riders would have avoided. The injuries he sustained in the fall, including what appears to have been a severe concussion, he exacerbated his existing health problems and contributed to the decline that would lead to his death 2 years later. The Pragmatic Sanction itself represents one of history's most expensive attempts to compensate for biological failure through political maneuvering. Charles spent enormous amounts of time, money, and diplomatic capital securing European recognition of his daughter's right to inherit his territories, essentially admitting that the Habsburg dynasty could no longer produce viable male heirs. The document that was supposed to preserve Habsburg power instead became a public acknowledgement of the family's genetic collapse. The international negotiations required to secure acceptance of the Pragmatic Sanction revealed how closely foreign courts had been monitoring Habsburg genetic problems. European powers demanded significant territorial and commercial concessions in exchange for recognizing Maria Theresa's succession rights, essentially extorting an emperor whose dynasty's biological problems had become a matter of international knowledge. The Habsburg genetic crisis had become a diplomatic weakness that could be exploited by rival powers. The economic consequences of Charles's succession crisis were enormous for an empire that was already struggling to compete with British and French commercial expansion. The emperor's desperate attempts to secure male succession led to expensive medical treatments, costly religious ceremonies, and ultimately the diplomatic concessions required to establish female inheritance rights. The Habsburg treasury, depleted by these expenses, would struggle to fund the military campaigns that would follow Charles's death. The military implications of having a genetically compromised ruler during a period of international tension were equally significant. Charles's chronic health problems made it difficult for him to provide effective leadership during the various conflicts that marked his reign, and his obvious physical weaknesses encouraged aggressive behavior from rival powers who correctly perceived Habsburg vulnerability. The religious dimensions of Charles's genetic crisis created particular problems for a dynasty that claimed to rule by divine right. The emperor's obvious fertility problems raised uncomfortable questions about whether God still favored the Habsburg bloodline, and the elaborate religious ceremonies designed to secure divine intervention in the succession crisis often seemed more desperate than devout. Palace chaplains found themselves in the awkward position of having to explain why divine favor wasn't translating into biological success. The medical treatments attempted on Charles throughout his life read like a catalogue of early 18th century medical desperation. Court physicians tried everything from traditional bloodletting and purging to experimental treatments involving exotic compounds and complex dietary regimens, but nothing could address the fundamental genetic problems that were undermining his health and fertility. The detailed medical records kept by his doctors provide valuable insights into how genetic disorders manifested before the development of modern medicine. The court life that surrounded Charles during his final years was carefully orchestrated to hide his obvious decline while maintaining the illusion of imperial authority. Public appearances were limited and carefully staged. Diplomatic audiences were conducted through elaborate protocols that minimized direct contact, and all important decisions were filtered through advisors who had learned to work around the emperor's physical and mental limitations. The death of Charles VI in October 1740 marked the end of what historians consider one of the most genetically compromised reigns in European history. The autopsy performed by court physicians revealed the full extent of his genetic burden. Digestive organs that were severely malformed, cardiovascular abnormalities that had contributed to his chronic fatigue, and reproductive organs that confirmed his fertility problems. The War of Austrian Succession that followed Charles's death wasn't just about Maria Theresa's right to inherit her father's territories. It was about the biological reality that the Habsburg dynasty had become so genetically compromised that it could no longer produce the male heirs that European inheritance law traditionally required. The conflict that would rage across Europe for 8 years was partly a consequence of genetic problems that had been building in the Habsburg bloodline for centuries. The international implications of Charles's genetic legacy influenced European attitudes toward hereditary monarchy for generations to come. His obvious unfitness, combined with the succession crisis that followed his death, contributed to growing skepticism about the divine right of kings and the biological superiority supposedly inherent in royal bloodlines. The economic analysis of Charles's reign reveals how genetic problems affecting individual rulers could have far-reaching consequences for entire economic systems. The Habsburg territories under his rule struggled with inconsistent policies, delayed infrastructure projects, and confused responses to commercial challenges, all reflecting the difficulties of governing with a leader whose personal capabilities were severely limited by genetic factors. The legacy of Charles VI represents the moment when Habsburg genetic problems transitioned from family tragedy to international crisis. His reign demonstrated that even the most sophisticated political and diplomatic systems couldn't fully compensate for the biological limitations created by generations of strategic inbreeding. The emperor, who devoted his life to securing his dynasty's political future, had inadvertently documented its biological collapse, creating a legal framework for female succession that was essentially an admission that male succession had become genetically impossible. Ferdinand IV of Naples' Bourbon Habsburg experiment. In the sun-drenched palaces of Naples, where Mediterranean light streams through windows designed to showcase royal magnificence, a unique genetic experiment was unfolding in the latter half of the 18th century. Ferdinand IV of Naples, known to his subjects as Re Nasone, King Big Nose, represented something new in the annals of royal inbreeding: the collision between Bourbon and Habsburg genetic material, creating a ruler whose personal characteristics would shock even courts accustomed to the eccentricities of inbred royalty. Born in 1751 as the third son of Charles III of Spain, Ferdinand inherited not just the crown of the two Sicilies, but also a complex genetic heritage that combined the relatively fresh Bourbon bloodline with the accumulated problems of the Habsburg dynasty through his mother's line. The genetic mathematics of Ferdinand's ancestry reveal the complexity of 18th century royal marriage politics. His father, Charles III, was himself a Bourbon with Habsburg genetic material through his mother, Elizabeth Farnese, while his mother, Maria Amalia of Saxony, carried royal bloodlines from across Europe. But the most significant genetic influence came through Ferdinand's grandmother, Elizabeth Farnese, whose Habsburg connections would prove decisive in shaping his physical and mental characteristics. The immediate physical manifestation of Ferdinand's genetic heritage was unmistakable and gave him his unflattering nickname. His nose was so disproportionately large that contemporary observers struggled to find polite ways to describe it in diplomatic correspondence. French ambassadors referred delicately to his distinctive profile, while British envoys were more direct in their reports back to London, describing a king whose nose preceded him into every room and whose profile resembled a caricature more than a portrait. But Ferdinand's nose was just the most visible symptom of a genetic condition that affected his entire body and mind. Contemporary accounts describe a man whose speech was slurred and childlike, whose movements were awkward and uncoordinated, and whose behavior often seemed more appropriate for a peasant than a king. Sir John Acton, the British-born minister who effectively ruled Naples for much of Ferdinand's reign, left detailed records describing the king's coarse manners and simple-minded approach to governance. The intellectual limitations that characterized Ferdinand throughout his life weren't just a matter of poor education. They reflected genuine cognitive deficits that modern physicians would recognize as possible signs of intellectual disability. Palace tutors, recruited from among the finest scholars in Europe, found themselves trying to teach basic reading and writing skills to a prince who struggled with concepts that normal children mastered effortlessly. His handwriting remained childlike throughout his life, and his ability to understand complex political situations was severely limited. The behavioral problems that made Ferdinand a source of embarrassment to European courts weren't just royal eccentricity. They were symptoms of a genetic condition that affected his social and emotional development. Contemporary observers documented his tendency to make inappropriate jokes during serious occasions, his inability to understand social hierarchies, and his preference for the company of fishermen and peasants over the courtiers who surrounded him. The marriage arrangement that brought Ferdinand together with Maria Carolina of Austria in 1768 represented another chapter in the complex interweaving of European royal bloodlines. Maria Carolina was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa and carried significant Habsburg genetic material, meaning that their union would further concentrate the genetic problems that had already affected Ferdinand's development. The wedding ceremony, held in the splendor of the royal palace of Naples, was carefully choreographed to minimize Ferdinand's obvious limitations while emphasizing the political benefits of the alliance. The fertility of Ferdinand and Maria Carolina's marriage was remarkably successful by royal standards, producing 18 children over the course of their union. But this reproductive success came at a significant genetic cost, as many of their children showed signs of the developmental problems that had affected their father. Palace medical records document a royal nursery plagued by learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and physical abnormalities that reflected the continuing impact of royal inbreeding. The administrative challenges that characterized Ferdinand's reign were directly related to his cognitive limitations. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies required sophisticated management to balance the competing interests of Naples and Sicily, maintain relationships with major European powers, and respond to the revolutionary upheavals that were sweeping across Europe. Ferdinand's inability to understand these complexities meant that real power quickly devolved to his ministers, particularly his wife Maria Carolina and the influential Sir John Acton. The Napoleonic crisis that defined the later years of Ferdinand's reign exposed the fundamental weakness of having an incompetent ruler during a period of international upheaval. When French revolutionary armies invaded Italy, Ferdinand's response was confused and ineffective, forcing the royal family to flee to Palermo under British protection. The king, who should have been rallying his subjects against foreign invasion, was instead asking his advisors to explain why the French were angry and whether they could simply be given some territory to make them go away. The relocation to Palermo during the Napoleonic Wars provided an opportunity to observe Ferdinand in a more relaxed environment, away from the formal protocols of court life. British naval officers who spent time with the exiled king documented his genuine enjoyment of simple pleasures, fishing, eating, and socializing with common sailors. These accounts reveal a man who might have been happier as a private citizen than as the ruler of a major European kingdom. The restoration that followed Napoleon's defeat brought Ferdinand back to Naples, but it also highlighted how little he had learned from his years of exile. The political situation in Italy had been fundamentally transformed by 20 years of revolutionary and Napoleonic upheaval. But Ferdinand seemed incapable of understanding these changes. His attempts to restore the old order often seemed more like childish nostalgia than serious political policy. The institutional impacts of Ferdinand's incapacity on Sicilian governance were profound and long-lasting. The complex relationship between Naples and Sicily, which required careful diplomatic balancing, was mismanaged during his reign, partly because Ferdinand couldn't understand the subtle differences between the two kingdoms. Administrative efficiency declined as officials struggled to implement policies based on confused royal directives, and regional tensions increased as local elites lost confidence in central authority. The international implications of Ferdinand's obvious unfitness influenced European attitudes toward the Bourbon Restoration after 1815. Foreign powers who had supported the return of legitimate monarchy found themselves dealing with a king whose limitations made effective governance impossible. The diplomatic correspondence from this period reveals growing frustration among European courts, with Ferdinand's inability to understand or implement the policies necessary for regional stability. The economic consequences of having an incompetent ruler during a crucial period of modernization were severe for the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. While other Italian states were beginning to develop modern infrastructure and administrative systems, Ferdinand's domains remained locked in feudal patterns that reflected his own inability to comprehend economic change. Trade relationships suffered from inconsistent policies, and investment in infrastructure was hampered by royal decisions that often contradicted previous commitments. The religious implications of Ferdinand's condition created particular problems for a kingdom where the Catholic Church played a central role in government and society. The king's childlike understanding of religious concepts made it difficult for him to fulfill his ceremonial duties as a Catholic monarch, and his behavioral problems often disrupted important religious ceremonies. Church officials found themselves in the awkward position of having to work around a ruler whose faith was genuine but whose understanding was fundamentally limited. The medical records kept throughout Ferdinand's long life provide valuable documentation of how genetic disorders can affect cognitive and physical development over many decades. Palace physicians documented his learning disabilities, his coordination problems, and his ongoing health issues, creating a clinical picture that modern medicine would recognize as probable intellectual disability, complicated by multiple physical abnormalities. The death of Ferdinand in 1825 marked the end of what historians consider one of the most cognitively compromised reigns in European history. The autopsy performed by court physicians revealed some of the physical abnormalities that had contributed to his limitations, including malformations of the skull and brain that suggested developmental problems present from birth. The succession that followed Ferdinand's death brought his son Francis I to the throne, but the new king had inherited many of his father's genetic problems, along with the political challenges created by decades of ineffective governance. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies would continue to struggle with the institutional weaknesses that had developed during Ferdinand's reign, contributing to the political instability that would eventually lead to Italian unification. The legacy of Ferdinand IV extends beyond his personal limitations to illustrate how genetic problems can compound political difficulties across generations. His reign demonstrated that even the most sophisticated administrative systems couldn't fully compensate for rulers whose cognitive abilities were fundamentally compromised by their genetic inheritance. The story of Ferdinand serves as a unique example of how different royal bloodlines could combine to create new forms of genetic compromise, showing that the problems of royal inbreeding weren't limited to any single dynasty, but reflected broader patterns of European royal marriage that prioritized political calculation over biological diversity. Ludwig I of Bavaria, fairy tale king on thin branches. High in the Bavarian Alps, where mist clings to castle spires and reality bends like light through stained glass windows, Ludwig II of Bavaria spends his final years constructing fairy tale palaces while his mind slowly unravels. The year is 1886, and the king who has bankrupted his kingdom building monuments to his own imagination is about to meet his mysterious end in the dark waters of Lake Starnberg. But the real mystery of Ludwig's story isn't his death. It's how the Wittelsbach family's centuries-old web of cousin marriages had finally produced a ruler whose genetic burden manifested not as physical deformity, but as a descent into madness so complete that it would inspire legends and operas for generations to come. The Wittelsbach dynasty that produced Ludwig II had been practicing strategic consanguinity for almost as long as the Habsburgs, but with a distinctly Bavarian twist that emphasized artistic patronage and romantic mysticism over pure political calculation. Ludwig's ancestry reads like a genealogical spiral, with the same names appearing repeatedly across multiple generations as Wittelsbach cousins, married other Wittelsbach cousins in an increasingly tight genetic circle. By the time of Ludwig's birth in 1845, the family tree had become so intertwined that calculating his exact coefficient of inbreeding requires advanced mathematical modeling. The circumstances of Ludwig's birth provided the first hints that something unusual was developing in the Wittelsbach bloodline. Palace physicians noted that the infant prince was unusually sensitive to light and sound, crying inconsolably when exposed to normal levels of stimulation. His sleep patterns were erratic from the beginning, with periods of deep unconsciousness alternating with nights of restless activity that would become a lifelong pattern. The childhood development that worried palace tutors and courtiers became more concerning as Ludwig entered adolescence. While he showed remarkable intelligence and artistic sensitivity, he also displayed what modern psychiatrists would recognize as early signs of mental illness. He spoke to imaginary companions, became obsessed with historical figures to the point of believing he could communicate with them, and showed an increasing preference for solitude over the social interactions that royal life required. The physical characteristics that marked Ludwig as a Wittelsbach were subtle but significant. He inherited the family's distinctive height and dramatic features, but he also showed signs of the neurological problems that had begun appearing in the bloodline. His hands trembled when he was nervous, his sleep cycles were severely disrupted, and he experienced what palace physicians described as fits of melancholy that could last for weeks at a time. The famous nocturnal lifestyle that characterized Ludwig's adult years wasn't just royal eccentricity. It was a symptom of the circadian rhythm disorders that often accompany genetic conditions affecting the nervous system. The king who built Neuschwanstein Castle conducted most of his business between midnight and dawn, sleeping through daylight hours and emerging only when darkness provided the Gothic atmosphere that matched his increasingly fantastical mental state. The architectural obsessions that defined Ludwig's reign were manifestations of what modern medicine would recognize as possible schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder. The elaborate castles he constructed weren't just expensive royal residences. They were physical expressions of the elaborate fantasy worlds that existed in his increasingly unstable mind. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee were built not for practical purposes but as stages for the complex historical dramas that Ludwig believed he was living. The isolation that marked Ludwig's later years reflected both his genetic predisposition toward mental illness and his growing awareness that his behavior was becoming incompatible with royal duties. The king, who had once enjoyed public ceremonies and state functions, gradually withdrew from all official activities, communicating with his ministers only through written messages, and conducting his reign from the remote mountain castles that had become his refuges from reality. The relationship between Ludwig and Richard Wagner reveals both the king's artistic sophistication and his deteriorating grasp on practical reality. Ludwig's patronage of Wagner wasn't just cultural enlightenment. It was the obsessive behavior of a man whose ability to distinguish between art and life was being compromised by genetic factors that affected his perception and judgment. The king who bankrupted Bavaria to fund Wagner's operas was living in the musical dramas more completely than in the actual kingdom he was supposed to govern. The financial crisis that dominated the later years of Ludwig's reign wasn't just the result of expensive building projects. It reflected the decision-making patterns of a ruler whose mental state made it impossible to understand cause and effect relationships. The king who spent millions on fairy tale castles while his kingdom struggled with basic infrastructure needs was operating according to the logic of fantasy rather than fiscal responsibility. The medical board that was assembled to evaluate Ludwig's mental state in 1886 represents one of the first systematic attempts to apply scientific psychiatry to royal governance. The physicians who examined the king documented symptoms that modern medicine would recognize as severe mental illness: paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, periods of catatonic withdrawal, and grandiose fantasies that bore no relationship to reality. The deposition proceeding that removed Ludwig from power was carefully orchestrated to avoid the political complications that would have resulted from a public trial. The medical evidence presented to justify his removal painted a picture of a king who was not just eccentric but genuinely unable to distinguish between his fantasy worlds and the practical requirements of governing a modern state. The mysterious death at Lake Starnberg that ended Ludwig's life has generated conspiracy theories for over a century, but the medical evidence suggests that his drowning was consistent with the kind of impulsive, self-destructive behavior that often characterizes severe mental illness. Whether Ludwig committed suicide, suffered an accident during a psychotic episode, or was murdered may never be known, but his death represented the final chapter in a genetic story that had been building for generations. The autopsy performed on Ludwig's body revealed some of the physical correlates of his mental condition. His brain showed abnormalities consistent with the neurological disorders that modern medicine associates with certain genetic conditions, and his general physical health had been compromised by years of erratic eating and sleeping patterns. The post-mortem analysis of Ludwig's jaw structure, conducted by German anatomists, revealed the distinctive Wittelsbach facial characteristics that had been developing over generations of consanguineous marriage. While not as extreme as the Habsburg jaw, Ludwig's mandibular structure showed signs of the genetic concentration that had affected his family's physical development. The international reaction to Ludwig's deposition and death revealed how closely European courts had been monitoring the Wittelsbach genetic situation. Foreign diplomats had been reporting on the Bavarian king's increasingly erratic behavior for years, and his removal from power was seen as confirmation that hereditary monarchy was producing rulers who were fundamentally unfit for modern governance. The cultural legacy of Ludwig II extends far beyond his personal tragedy to influence European attitudes toward mental illness, artistic patronage, and the relationship between genius and madness. His story contributed to romantic notions about the connection between creativity and psychological instability, while also providing stark evidence of how genetic problems could manifest as psychiatric rather than purely physical disorders. The economic analysis of Ludwig's reign reveals how mental illness in rulers could have far-reaching consequences for entire kingdoms. Bavaria's financial crisis during his reign wasn't just the result of expensive building projects. It reflected the systematic inability of a mentally ill king to make rational decisions about resource allocation and long-term planning. The institutional adaptations that developed in Bavaria during Ludwig's reign represent early examples of how governmental systems could be modified to compensate for mentally incompetent rulers. The bureaucratic structures that emerged to manage royal incapacity would influence Bavarian governance for decades and provide models for other kingdoms facing similar challenges. The story of Ludwig II serves as a bridge between the older patterns of royal inbreeding that had characterized earlier centuries and the modern understanding of mental illness that would emerge in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His reign demonstrated that genetic problems could manifest as psychiatric symptoms rather than purely physical abnormalities, expanding the understanding of how consanguineous marriage affected royal fitness. George III of Great Britain, Porphyria, Pedigree. In the drawing rooms of Kew Palace, where the walls seemed to whisper with the echoes of confused royal pronouncements, George III of Great Britain sits in his specially padded chair, his blue-tinged urine collected in chamber pots that have become medical specimens for puzzled court physicians. The year is 1788, and the king, who has already lost one empire, is about to lose his mind in a series of episodes so dramatic that they will reshape British constitutional history and provide future generations with one of the most extensively documented cases of royal genetic disease in human history. The Hanoverian bloodline that produced George III represented a relatively fresh genetic departure from the extreme consanguinity that had characterized other European royal families, but it carried its own distinctive hereditary burden. The House of Hanover had been brought to the British throne partly because of its Protestant credentials and partly because of its supposed genetic vigor compared to the inbred Stuart line it replaced. But the very traits that made the Hanoverians politically attractive, their prolific fertility and robust physical constitutions, masked a genetic time bomb that would explode in George III's deteriorating mental state. The physical manifestation of George III's genetic condition wasn't immediately apparent in the dramatic deformities that had marked Habsburg or Wittelsbach rulers, but in the subtle biochemical processes that would eventually drive him to madness. The porphyria that modern medical historians believe afflicted George wasn't just a metabolic disorder. It was a hereditary condition that could be traced through multiple generations of Hanoverian ancestry, affecting the body's ability to produce heme, the iron-containing compound that gives blood its red color. The early signs of George's condition appeared during his teenage years, but were dismissed as royal eccentricity or adolescent awkwardness. Palace attendants noted his unusual sensitivity to sunlight, his occasional complaints of severe abdominal pain, and his tendency toward mood swings that seemed disproportionate to their apparent causes. But these symptoms were mild enough that they didn't interfere with his royal duties or raise concerns about his fitness to rule. The first major episode that revealed the true nature of George's condition occurred in 1765, when the 27-year-old king experienced what court physicians described as a violent disorder. For several weeks, George suffered from severe abdominal pain, confusion, and periods of apparent delirium where he would speak rapidly and incoherently about subjects that seemed to have no connection to reality. The episode passed, leaving the king apparently normal, but providing the first clear indication that something was seriously wrong with the royal biochemistry. The agricultural passions that characterized George's middle years weren't just royal hobbies. They were therapeutic activities that provided relief from the psychological stress that could trigger his genetic condition. The king, who became known as Farmer George, found genuine peace in the practical work of crop rotation and livestock breeding, activities that kept him grounded in physical reality when his brain chemistry was threatening to pull him into confusion and delusion. The American Revolutionary War that dominated the 1770s and early 1780s placed enormous stress on George's system, and contemporary observers noted an increase in his erratic behavior during this period. The king, who was determined to maintain British control over the American colonies, often seemed to be fighting his own internal battles as much as the external conflict, making decisions that reflected confused judgment and an inability to process complex political information effectively. The Great Madness of 1788 that nearly ended George's reign provided European courts with an unprecedented opportunity to observe royal mental illness in clinical detail. The king's symptoms during this episode included violent mood swings, rapid and incoherent speech, physical aggression toward courtiers, and periods of apparent hallucination where he would hold conversations with long-dead historical figures. Palace physicians documented every detail, creating medical records that provide modern scientists with valuable insights into how porphyria affects brain function. The blue urine that became the most famous symptom of George's condition wasn't just a medical curiosity, it was a diagnostic marker that helped court physicians recognize the pattern of his illness. The distinctive color was caused by the buildup of porphyrins in his system, chemical compounds that his body couldn't properly process due to his genetic condition. The chamber pots that contained this unusual urine became the subject of intense medical study as physicians struggled to understand what was happening to their king. The rambling speeches that characterized George's psychotic episodes provide fascinating insights into how genetic disorders can affect cognitive function. During his worst attacks, the king would deliver lengthy monologues that started with apparently rational observations but gradually descended into word salad, stream of consciousness rambling that revealed the breakdown of normal mental processes. Court stenographers dutifully recorded these speeches, creating documents that modern psychiatrists study for clues about the relationship between brain chemistry and language function. The Regency crisis that followed George's 1788 breakdown represented the first time in British history that a monarch's genetic condition had created a constitutional emergency. Parliament was forced to debate whether the king was mentally competent to continue ruling, what legal mechanisms existed for transferring power to a regent, and how long they should wait for royal recovery before making permanent arrangements. The political solution they developed would influence British constitutional practice for generations. The recovery that allowed George to resume his royal duties in 1789 was as mysterious as his initial breakdown, demonstrating the episodic nature of porphyria and the difficulty of predicting when genetic conditions will manifest. The king, who had been raving and incontinent one month, was apparently normal the next, leading to wild theories about divine intervention, medical miracles, and the healing power of agricultural work. The fertility problems that affected George's marriage to Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz provide evidence that his genetic condition affected more than just his mental state. Despite producing 15 children, the royal couple experienced numerous miscarriages and infant deaths that suggested genetic incompatibilities or disorders affecting fetal development. Several of their surviving children would later display symptoms similar to their fathers, confirming the hereditary nature of the condition. The later episodes that marked George's final years were progressively more severe and longer-lasting, suggesting that his genetic condition was worsening with age. By 1810, when the regency became permanent, the king was essentially living in a fantasy world where he believed his dead father was still alive and that he was married to Elizabeth Pembroke rather than Queen Charlotte. The careful notes kept by his attendants document a mind that had lost its grip on reality but retained fragments of personality and memory. The treatments attempted on George throughout his illness read like a catalogue of late 18th century medical desperation. Court physicians tried bloodletting, purging, cold baths, restraints, and experimental drugs, but nothing addressed the fundamental biochemical problems that were causing his symptoms. The famous mad doctor, Francis Willis, who claimed to have cured the king in 1789, used techniques that were more psychological than medical, suggesting that some of George's recovery was due to environmental factors rather than medical intervention. The international implications of George's madness influenced European attitudes toward British stability and reliability throughout the Napoleonic period. Foreign courts that had to negotiate with Britain never knew whether they were dealing with policies made by a sane king or decisions filtered through the confused mental state of a monarch whose judgment was compromised by genetic disease. The religious dimensions of George's condition created particular problems for a king who was head of the Church of England. His episodes often included religious mania, with elaborate prayers and sermons that revealed both deep faith and serious mental disturbance. Church officials struggled to reconcile their belief in divine right monarchy with the obvious evidence that God had allowed their king to be afflicted with mental illness. The death of George III in 1820 marked the end of what historians consider one of the most medically documented reigns in British history. The autopsy performed by royal physicians revealed some of the physical correlates of his genetic condition, including abnormalities in his nervous system and evidence of the metabolic disorders that had contributed to his psychological symptoms. The succession that brought George IV to the throne also brought the question of whether the new king had inherited his father's genetic predisposition to mental illness. Contemporary observers noted that George IV displayed some of the behavioral patterns that had characterized his father's early years, though his condition never progressed to the dramatic psychotic episodes that had marked the previous reign. The legacy of George III's madness extends far beyond his personal tragedy to influence British constitutional development, medical understanding of genetic disease, and European attitudes toward hereditary monarchy. His story demonstrated that even relatively diverse royal bloodlines could carry genetic problems that would manifest under stress, and that the political systems needed to evolve to accommodate the biological realities of hereditary rule. The modern medical analysis of George III's condition has provided valuable insights into how porphyria affects brain function and behavior, making his case one of the most studied examples of genetic disease in historical figures. His story continues to influence understanding of the relationship between biochemistry and mental health, demonstrating how genetic factors can shape not just individual lives, but entire political systems.